All right, and we're back from our lunch break and our dedication. So we'll move on. Madam Clerk, will you read the consent agenda for us, please?
I will. The consent agenda items are expected to be routine and non-controversial. They will be acted upon by the board at one time without discussion. Any board member, staff member, or interested party may request removal of an item from the consent agenda for later discussion. So just to get everybody on the same page, right before the lunch break, the following items were pulled from consent. Item 10, item 13, item 14, item 17, and item 19. The balance of the consent agenda was approved unanimously on a motion by Supervisor Mills and a second by Supervisor Garamendi.
All right, so moving on, I don't see Mr. Moore in here who pulled item number 10, so we'll move on to item number 13. Mr. We'll give him a few minutes to see if he shows up. We'll move on to item 13. Mr. Fry, you pulled this item?
Yes, I did.
Can you come up to the podium so you can...
So item 13 is from the Auditor Controller to adopt a resolution establishing ad valorem property tax rates for fiscal year 2018 and 19.
So please tell me about item 13. Somebody.
This is the Auditor Controller put this item on.
George, did you get a copy of the agenda item? Have you read it?
I was going to say,
Yeah.
Are we looking for an explanation?
Yes, I am.
and I'm
You
sorry.
want to speak about it?
I could help you if you'd
He
like.
needs a minute to pull
Yeah, I
up
was gonna
the
say,
IQ.
Every year, under the government code, the auditor is required to set the ad valorem tax rates for all of the various levies that are within the county. And they do and can vary from year to year, but it is required, especially for voter-approved indebtedness. It's just part of what we do. So this is a yearly rate that is being set as required by state law. There's actually a constitution piece to it, I think, if I remember correctly.
Hang on. Any other board comments? Tim, are you still pulling it up?
Yeah, and thank you, Supervisor Mills. And yeah, government code does specify that annually the county must adopt, the board must adopt the resolution that sets those property tax rates. Typically, they wouldn't always necessarily change, but again, it's going to be based on what special districts might be approved. You know, again, based on the formula that's laid out from...
Well, I'm looking for transparency. And what they're saying here doesn't say much about transparency. People out in TV land would probably like to know about it because it's going to impact their taxes.
If I could just add the last piece to that in terms of impacting the taxes. This is existing property tax. This is not a new property tax. The only reason their taxes may be impacted would be if the assessor were to, through the normal assessment means, have an increase in value for their property, or if they added an addition to their property which changed the value. But this wouldn't... all this is telling it is for each dollar that you pay in those property taxes, who gets a portion of that dollar? The school districts, special districts, the county. So it would not, this does not have a direct impact on raising anyone's taxes. It just says how it gets allocated.
Distribution of those taxes.
Chair, that is correct. It is the distribution of the taxes.
Al, you got a question?
Yeah, a simple one. It says adopt a resolution establishing ad valorem property tax rates for fiscal year 2018-19. Well, that would imply that you're going to approve or establish these rates. Wouldn't it be proper to disclose what those rates would be?
Board Chair, I just want to clarify to the public, in the actual staff report, the discussion, it lays all of that out. So it lists the government code section that this is under. It's government code 29100 and 29103 specifically. And then in the staff report discussion, it lays out the distribution numbers between the general property tax, the general obligation bonds, Mark Twain bond series. It gives the percentage in the staff report, and certainly if you would like to see that, that can be made available to you.
So it's the staff report that basically you're approving, even though the conclusion of the staff report is not disclosed. Though it can be if we search for it.
It is part of the agenda packet. It's all part of that, as well as the resolution that is before the board to be adopted.
Okay, so the packet that the Board of Supervisors has discloses what these rates are. Well, thank you.
Chair, I can also bring forward that the agenda packet that's available to the public has this information in it.
Okay.
All you need to do is download the public version of the agenda packet.
Yes.
Or go into the clerk recorder's office and you can look at the agenda items one by one or in its entirety on the computers there in the lobby.
Vicki just showed it to me, thank you.
Yeah, and that's every agenda item on our agendas. Okay. All right, so we'll bring it back to the board. Looking for a motion.
So moved.
A motion by Supervisor Mills. Do I have a second? Second. Second by Supervisor Clapp. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Passes 5-0. Moving on to item number 14.
Item 14 is from the Sheriff's Department to accept the 2018 State of California Department of Parks and Recreation Off-Highway Motor Vehicle, OHV, grant agreement in the amount of $47,897 and authorize the sheriff to sign and submit the grant agreement.
Supervisor Oliveira, you pulled this item.
I did. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sheriff, I understand. Thank you for coming in, your presence here. There are a couple of questions I'd like to ask you on this.
Ask away, Supervisor Oliveira.
All right, we man this with a part-time deputy position with the vehicle and benefits and things, correct?
No, it's a full-time position.
It's a full-time position now?
Yes.
Okay, great. What would happen if we lose access to public lands where OHV and snowmobiling is allowed? Would that decrease this contract?
Say that, ask that again, please.
What would happen if we lose access to ATV and snowmobiling in Calaveras County? Would that decrease the need for deputy enforcement of local state laws?
No, it would not, because we would still have calls for service out there. What it would do, though, is it would impact our tourism, because we have a lot of snowmobilers, a lot of hikers, campers, four-wheelers that utilize those roads. So if for some reason they close those services down, we would be losing that revenue from people coming into our county to utilize the recreation part of those roadways, whether it be during the snow time or during summertime.
So we would still have that quasi-FTE full-time employee position?
No, the FTE position would go away, but we would still be dealing with calls for service out there. Just because the program went away doesn't mean that the calls for service would go away, because people would still be utilizing those roadways, and if there was a call for service, we would still have to respond.
Okay, the reason I ask that question is there is a movement right now by the Forest Service. They're actually holding hearings that has caused some great contention among people who recreate, especially up the Highway 4 corridor, to reach Alpine County, reach our snowmobile and ATV areas. I will be actually attending that meeting on October 2nd to find out if those areas are going to be restricted, which it looks like there's options on the Forest Service plan to reduce those areas for access.
They've been
Would that put a different calls for service, if you will, for those folks that are using ATV or snowmobiling in those restricted areas, or is that enforced by the Forest Service?
Well, we still enforce those areas for the Forest Service as part of the contract. If they restricted those areas, the catch-22 is whether they would, those services would go away, because people are continuing to use those areas as they do behind White Pines and out at Penny Pines behind Avery now. They continue to use those. I was out there riding when I was a kid. They've closed those areas to motorized vehicles, but people still go out there. That's why we have this contract, is to patrol those areas.
Okay. Thank you very much, Sheriff.
You bet.
Appreciate you coming by.
Absolutely.
Thank
Anything
you.
else?
Any other public comments on this item? Seeing none, we'll bring it back. Looking for a motion.
I'll move the motion.
Motion by Supervisor Oliveira, second.
Second.
Second by Supervisor Garamendi. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Passes 5-0. Moving on to item number 17.
Item 17 is from Code Compliance to uphold an administrative citation for Joella Neal, located at 1978 Big Flat Road, Murphys, California, authorizing abatement and a lien for administrative and abatement costs.
Supervisor Oliveira.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. May I speak with Code Compliance, please? Thank you for coming over.
Thank you. You're welcome.
This issue has been a contentious issue in Murphy's dealing with this property. I've had several opportunities to receive input from constituents. And I know that we're actually applying now for a citation to be issued on this property. Is that correct?
No, we're here for the abatement.
Clean up.
Could you
We want the
take
authorization to go
2
in and
seconds
clean
and
it.
tell us what that's going to entail, please?
The piece of property is being, basically, I'm not sure who's on the property. We've tried, notifying the property owner and got no response. I did get one letter back that was refused, which was a citation. All of our regular mailings were picked up. They did not come back. I've got little idea on who's out there, but they're moving a bunch of trailers, trash, garbage, cars onto this property. The neighbors are concerned because it's a fire hazard, and nobody wants that in their neighborhood.
Okay. Thank you, Courtney. Did a good job on this one. I just wanted an opportunity for the public to realize our code compliance is effective.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming out. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any public comments? Seeing none, we'll bring it back to the board for a motion.
Mr. Chair, I'll move the motion.
We have a motion by Supervisor Oliveira. Do I have a second?
Second.
Second by Garamendi. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Passes 5-0. Moving on to item number 19.
So item 19 is from the Administrative Office to authorize the purchasing agent to advertise for bids, execute purchase orders and contracts in amounts up to $250,000 in accordance with federal FEMA, Cal OES, and local procurement guidelines, or up to whatever amounts are budgeted within various disaster budgets for the acquisition of goods, supplies, equipment rentals, and services necessary for expedited completion of projects associated with Butte Fire and Winter Storm Emergency Disaster Declarations projects.
And Mr. Chair, if I may, I was going to request that we withdraw this item. There were some questions that we'd like to lay out and address, bring back on a date uncertain at this point.
Is the board okay with that? Okay, then we will withdraw this item.
So, Mr. Chair, if we could go back to item 10.
Yes, we will.
Thank you.
Item number 19 has been withdrawn by the CAO. All right, moving back to item 10, and the person that pulled this is not in the room, so we'll go forward with a motion.
Would you like me to read it into the record?
Yeah, you can read into it. I'm
So
sorry.
item 10 is from Public Works, to adopt a resolution to vacate a 15-foot wide lane off of Main Street between lots 8 and 9 in the Vallecito town site.
Chair, I reviewed this, so there's no discussion from my part.
You can start, yes, sure.
I would simply move to approve.
Second.
We have a motion to approve by Supervisor Mills. Well, we haven't really pulled, I guess, the person that pulled it's not here to ask any questions, so no, we're going to go forward with it as if it was a consent agenda.
Don't have to.
We still have,
I would recommend that since it was pulled, that you solicit public
all right,
comment.
so let's move to public comments. Yes, Robert.
Just prior to the lunch, as we were exiting, I had an opportunity to speak with the gentleman who pulled the item.
Oh, okay.
And I asked him why he pulled the item. What he was interested in knowing was whether or not this was public property, the lane to be vacated. He was interested in knowing whether it was public property. So I explained to him that the county has an easement, and this is an old town site lane that was identified in the 1876 town site map. I have a copy of that here if you wish to have that. So in the application that came to us from Mr. Metzger, he wanted that lane to be vacated. We follow the Streets and Highways Code procedures for vacating this old lane that appears only on the map, and it doesn't look like it was improved. Perhaps 100 years ago, someone may have used it for their horses or something, but at this point, there's nothing there. And the summary vacation process is the appropriate process to remove the public's interest in this lane.
I can give you a bit of history here. That lane back in those days was used as an entrance to the rear of the butcher shop. Okay, behind the dance hall.
Thank you.
Okay.
I see.
In the 1800s.
Any other public comments?
What else is missing?
All right, no public comments. So we have a motion by Supervisor Mills. We have a second by Supervisor Oliveira. There were no public comments, so we'll call for a vote. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Passes 5-0.
Mr. Chair, could we take a 5-minute break to get the presentation set up?
We can take a 5-minute break. We have a presentation that needs to be set up.
Thank you.
All right, we're back in session. Madam Clerk, item number 25.
Item 25 is from the Administrative Office to conduct the fiscal year 2018-19 final budget hearings and direct staff to return on September 25th, 2018 with the final budget resolutions.
CAO Lutz.
Yes, the favorite time of September, budget hearings. I will try and be fairly concise in the presentation today. Again, noting where we left off from recommended budget. We had some adjustments that we went back and asked departments to make. I'll talk through that. This will really focus heavily on kind of what's changed from July or June when we did our hearing to where we are today. So just an overview, I'm going to talk a little bit about the 17-18 close wrap-up discussion. Also then look for going into this year, budget request snapshot for all of the funds, and then as we typically do, drill down into the general fund. Provide some kind of summary of key strengths and changes over recommended, and then also an overview of the reductions that departments made to their general fund requests. And closing, revisit some of the equity increases that were deferred in June to final budget. We'll be bringing those back and discussing that today as well. So with that then, looking at how we closed last year, and overall our closeout was at or above projections. If the board recalls, we estimated for June a $9 million carryover fund balance. The actual fund balance came out to 9.731, and again, I think that that emphasizes wherever possible, the auditor, CAO, all of us trying to do kind of worst case scenarios in hopes that we get nice things like this rather than the opposite direction. And so you typically would see the difference between those two if you didn't fully expend contracts that were budgeted, or if you had additional unanticipated revenues. Any of those types of things can mean the difference. When projecting, you always try and assume worst case, that revenue won't come in and expenses will all be realized. We also ended the year with the trend that we identified in mid-year and tracked through the remaining year of a generally strong revenue picture. Our sales tax, 17% above what we budgeted. Our transient occupancy tax, 8% above what we budgeted. And the excise tax, 44% above what we budgeted. So overall, the point being on our closeout is that we definitely closed at a good spot to be now going into the 18-19 fiscal year. Just quick note, and this carries over from the recommended budget, but did want to mention that again we make an assumption on the assessment roll. And so when we did our budget in June, the estimate was about a 3.5% increase. What we expected the roll could be. The assessor's office closed a very strong, thank you, Leslie, a very strong 6.59% increase. And so what that means locally for us is approximately an additional $741,000 that comes back to the general fund as a result of that strong roll close. It also means from where we estimated initially at recommended to now is a difference or an increase of another $350,000 over what our initial assumption was when I plugged everything in for our revenues. So that does translate back to additional revenue that we didn't anticipate that we would receive in the recommended budget. The sales tax numbers, again, also, as I mentioned before, there was an increase. They're on that projection where we had about a 4% increase over fiscal year 16-17. You can see these last 3 years, particularly some strong growth numbers with more economic recovery, more economic activity. The question being, on that slowing line, watching that closely and trying to not overestimate the growth. For next year, we assumed a 2% growth in sales tax for this budget.
Just a question. On the previous years, the blue line was our forecast, and the green was where we ended up.
No, the blue line, so it includes the triple flip, and you'll notice up here where I note the language up here. This was back in 2001 and 2002, where the state did a borrowing mechanism where they played the shell game of borrow from this pot, then we're going to, because we borrowed from your sales tax, we're going to make you whole through another pot of money. What that's showing is what our sales tax in total would have been if not for that, so we're comparing apples to apples. So that's the only reason that we note it there. The triple flip was fully unwound when it got to 15, 16, and that's why you see it disappear here for 16, 17, and on. So it's just the state's shell games that they play with sales tax particularly.
Thank you.
Transient occupancy tax, again, has shown some significant increases over the last few years, really, obviously, with hotel inventory. We've had some, but a lot of that ends up coming down to the extreme rise in Airbnbs and alternative options for, those kind of non-traditional hotel-type rooms. So our TOT ended with 21% growth over fiscal year 17-18. Sorry, there was an error in my notes. So the numbers are strong, but they actually did end up a little lower than initially projected at mid-year, something that we're watching closely, particularly in light of the November ballot measure where we're asking the voters to increase the TOT. On one side, the TOT has certainly showed some tremendous growth opportunity, and tying into that as a stronger revenue source would certainly help. But we also are sensitive to the fact that you start to reach market saturation somewhat unless there are more hotels coming in or a lot of new units that are going to be dedicated to vacation rentals. So that's really a summary of where we ended last year. Again, summarizing, I think, strong overall revenue picture, still at the point of, optimistic that this year is going to continue to be a economy of growth, but obviously being cognizant of if we reach next July, we're going to be on a historic level of expansion, and knowing that at some point we need to be prepared for potential downturns. So within our budget snapshot, and these slides will require a little bit of narrative because I want to explain some methodology changes that I think are very important to note. And I'll start with here to kind of give you a point to reference for it. So you can see where our 17-18 adopted budget is at, our 18-19 final budget, and obviously the thing that stands out the most down here, $174 million versus the 163 for the prior year. And if you look at what the breakdown represents across those funds, you can kind of see where the bulk of that activity is. General fund being the largest portion, health and human services being the second largest. You have public works, and then a number of the other programs that are out there, capital improvements being another large one. But what I think this fails to fully address is what this slide in fact shows, and that is breaking down where those dollars are appropriated. So one of the challenges that I know the auditor had brought up when I came here and was pretty clearly obvious in looking at how we were reporting on some of our funds is we actually were not really not utilizing best practices, and certainly skirting whether or not we're fully reporting under GASB on what our fund balances need to be. So part of this unwinding, and that's part of the new budget system, part of a new process, being able to open up the hood, take a look at things that are working, things that aren't, is how do we deal with this fund balance that in a lot of cases we're just rolling around within these funds, not very noticeable or transparent to anybody that there's actually some cash in there. It has to be used for those specific funds, but nonetheless, there's fund balance. Just like the general fund carries a fund balance, a lot of our operating funds carry fund balances. So to address that, we required all departments to use a contingency budget line. And what that basically meant is when the auditor closed the books on June 30, then it was, all right, your fund balance at reconciliation is this. We expect that if your appropriation, if how much you're asking to spend is less than your fund balance, we need to account for what that gap is. That's according to Gatsby. And so what we needed to do then is put that on that contingency line. So you can see this second column here breaks down the differences between what a department is saying, yeah, realistically, this is more in line with my operating budget, and this side is basically what I have in contingency for whether it be a future project. Some contingency or funds actually require you to carry a certain balance, such as in Health and Human Services on some of their Mental Health Services Act funds. So there are some instances where you have to require a certain level of funding in reserve, but there are also others where you have more flexibility. Certainly it's good, like in the general fund, to see a decent fund balance. What this does highlight, and a future item for the board to consider as we continue to revise and update our financial policy, is this puts us in a good spot to have a fund balance policy. What percentage should you be holding in fund balance? We did it this year for the general fund, where the board adopted a 2% of appropriations to be held and in the contingency when the budget's built, but we haven't thus far done it for our other operating funds, and that's going to be an important distinction of how much is too much. If it's sitting in the bank, what should we be doing with it, versus if there's a downturn, we want to be prepared for it. So I hope that adequately explains. If you take the 155 plus the 19, you come back to this number right here on this page for your total appropriation. So I thought it was important to note what that formula looks like, is taking into account this contingency. So you're really looking at that plus that to come back to that 174 that was on the prior page. And then providing a breakdown of those operating funds by service category. I think this is a really good graph because it shows you kind of from an operations standpoint, what areas are we working in? What areas are we doing? Where are we spending the most? Health, human safety, about 32% of the expenditures. Public safety and protection, 16%. County administration, finance, 12%, and then capital infrastructure, 9%, your land use departments at 12%. So this gives you a good picture of how we're, in terms of service delivery, where the money is allocated. Any questions before I move on to the general fund specifically? Okay. So within the general fund, this similar breakdown, only this time again just by the general funded departments. You can see where the service categories are broken down. Looking at it in a graph, in the same type of graph that we saw before for all operating funds. In this case, you can see how much we're spending in the general fund for different service areas. Public safety and protection, about 37%. County admin and finance, 33%. Disaster response and recovery, 20%. Obviously a huge chunk of our general fund in recent years with both Butte fire, tree mortality, and also winter storms. And then breaking out what our revenue looks like within the general fund. This one's always an important one for me, is how are we funding the operations within the general fund? So you can see here, breaks it down by taxes, licenses, permits, and franchise fees. Also things like fines, revenue from use of money, intergovernmental revenue, state and federal. A lot of that comes back with disaster recovery dollars, but it also would include some of the state and federal funds that we might get through the sheriff's department or other programs. Charges for services is our fees, what we can charge legitimately and recover for. And then, other smaller items, transfers in would be a larger one, but that transfers in usually is from, if we have a designated fund that supports those programs. An example would be Sheriff's AB 443 is a designated fund that gets transferred into the sheriff's, programs to help offset their costs. And so it winds up in a general funded program.
Tim, we say AB 443 falls in other financing sources.
No, it's operating transfers in is where it falls into.
What is miscellaneous revenue?
Miscellaneous revenue, I'm looking over to Rebecca, I'm trying to think of a good example of miscellaneous revenue for offhand, trying to remember what those categories were.
Yeah, miscellaneous revenue is basically any, and I hate to say this, but it's any revenue that doesn't meet the terms of the rest of the revenues. So it could be refunds that we get back on something, or it could be court settlement revenue. It could be it's just kind of a general.
Junk drawer of the kitchen.
It is. And so the one thing to kind of, I guess, have peace of mind is there's not very much of it, because we watch it like a hawk, because those are some of the things that will get dinged on by the outside auditor if we're counting something as miscellaneous revenue and it really should have been charges for services. So we do really scrutinize whether a department should be using miscellaneous revenue as the coding structure or not. But it's kind of that kind of kitchen sink catch-all revenue that doesn't meet the terms of any of the other revenues.
Thank you. I'm glad you were like trying to remember specific examples too, because I'm like, to Rebecca's point, the state controller, they want to see us categorize everything very, very narrowly. So there aren't a lot of things that fall in there.
Yeah.
I'm fine with that. You see $993,000 miscellaneous.
I'll be happy to look into what those items are and give you a
You guys sound like you're walking.
piece back.
Rebecca, question. And at what point does a miscellaneous reach a threshold that would require a line item or change?
It's not a threshold. It's just, does a revenue, when a department comes and deposits miscellaneous revenue, we really do look at it to go, well, what was the basis of it? What was it from? Did you submit an invoice to an outside agency to get that money? Because then from our perspective, that's not miscellaneous revenue, it's charges for services. Or was it received because you submitted a claim to a state, federal, or even maybe it's from a nonprofit, maybe it's from some other governmental agency, JPA, whatever. We have a chart of accounts that can accommodate all of that. This is truly, when I think about it, I think of a lot of it has to do with like refunds that we get back from overpayments of workers' comp insurance from prior year, or a court settlement that has been going on for the last 10 years, whatever it is, that we never thought we were going to see it. We had expenses that went out several years ago. Now all of a sudden we're getting that money. There's just a kind of a myriad of different types of revenues. I believe that donations may fall into miscellaneous revenue as well, donation revenue, which we do get for several departments.
Am I okay moving on? No other questions? Okay. So then again, just graphically on a pie, you can see for the general fund what percentages of these types of revenues comprise the revenue that runs the program. 30% roughly coming from taxes. Right now, particularly with the disaster recovery operations, intergovernmental revenue from the state and also from the feds, both comprising about 18% each. Ordinarily, those certainly wouldn't be as large, but they're skewed more in light of the recovery. Charges for services being another large area, as are those operating transfers in through those designated funds that are set aside for a certain purpose, that are used as needed or for specific purposes or projects. So then now turning to the final budget key strengths and changes over recommended. So we did see, again, departments were asked to reduce at 5%. And I'm happy to report that every department, one, worked very hard to reach that. There were some instances where it wasn't going to be feasible for one reason or another. But overall, we achieved actually a total of 5.6% in reductions instead of at the 5%, where we had some that could do more. We could do different options. What we looked at was a department as a whole. So in the case of the, and I'll show a little bit about this when I get into a couple of slides, but in the case of like Sheriff's Department, I'll use them because they have a lot of units. The goal was to look at them and their general fund as an aggregate, not by individual unit, with the idea that you can be a little more flexible if, maybe you reduce more from this unit, you don't touch that unit, and you reduce a little bit from another one, things like that, that really looking at it from an aggregate, as long as we get to the 5% that we're trying to get to, the total amount, then we're still okay. And that kind of goes away from just the straight across the board every single unit, so it allows department heads to make a little more strategic choices in what they feel they can manage and do. As I noted before on our revenue increases, so the 5.6% reduction netted $1.709 million that then was freed up in general fund liability that could go into contingency. The assessment roll close that I mentioned earlier, again being higher than estimates, that was the additional 741. Larger than anticipated fund balance, that gave us 731, and overall we came back with a 3.181 million positive change to the general fund position. The direct result of that then was being able to build our general fund contingency to 3.922 million. The total amount of that is 5.53% of our general fund appropriations. That's important because per board's financial policy of at least funding contingencies to 2%, we're more than double the board's financial policy on meeting that 2%. Talking about some of our other funds and accounts, we also have maintained general fund reserve. The fund balance at this point is $5.2 million. Based on what's been budgeted and anticipated this year, we didn't budget putting anything in it, but we also didn't budget taking anything out of it. And so we're holding at that 5.2. That represents 7.36% of total 18-19 appropriations, and that's including the disaster recovery expenses. The Teeter Fund also starting off with a fund balance at $7.3 million. We do have budgeted transfers out, those transfers out being for a number of the capital projects that were discussed with the board with the space plan. A number of those include large things like architectural services, the district attorney's building, some of the remodel for the assessors, the auditor controllers area. We're using teeter in some instances. Our capital improvement CI, or our COP, I should say, funds in other areas where they're allowable. But the mix and what we've budgeted thus far in our capital improvement budget is using the 1.9 million from teeter, with an estimate revenue coming in of another 1.03 million. That puts us at our estimated fund balance of $6.4 million. The goal here, again, using teeter for those intended purposes. In the case of, and I forgot to mention on some of those CIP projects, we also have some IT infrastructure upgrades that are going to be necessary and taking place, both within the Sheriff's Department for some new servers, but then also some of our network bandwidth that needs to be increased and has been being increased in order to provide more effective internet access across the campus.
So in an up economy, your teeter fund is actually going to be lower year over year simply because people will be paying their taxes on time. Do you have any kind of a trajectory to say where we're going with that, or do you feel that that number will remain pretty stable at $1 million a year?
So it's kind of funny, but the revenue into the general fund teeter fund was the lowest this go around that it's been in years. And it didn't really have anything to do with the economy. It had to do with everyone was so afraid because of the tax reform that they were going to be overly taxed. So they tried to pay both installments of their property taxes so that they could include all of it on their tax return. So, so the bad news was that was not good for teeter. That wasn't good for the teeter program, because where teeter gets its money is from the penalties and the interest, right? So we really want, we don't want everybody to pay their taxes late, but we want a good, a decent percentage of delinquency so that they will have to pay penalties and interest. So we actually had the lowest revenue that I've seen in many years because everybody rushed and went and paid their taxes on time. It's unlikely now that that kind of initial onset for the benefit of paying your 2 installments up front, I doubt that's going to happen again. So our delinquency rate generally stays pretty flat and even. So I would guess that we will actually see a little bit higher than this revenue. We'll probably go back to kind of where we were. The only caveat to what could make that number change, because in essence what happens is teeter isn't really a thing, it's an action, right? And so we are we're taking the penalties and the interest, and the whole purpose of the teeter program, that teeter function, is to make a tax loss reserve. And that tax loss reserve is there to pay for tax losses, right? So if a property ended up having to go to tax sale and it sells for $70,000, but it owed $100,000, the tax loss reserve is there to pick up the difference. So, and we've been pretty lucky that we haven't had very many tax loss sales. We really haven't had that many. We've had a handful, but not a ton. What I would say, and I've had this discussion with administration, and I've had this discussion with the building department, is the more emphasis we put on code compliance, that is potentially where we will see, if we put a lot of emphasis on the teeter program through code abatement costs, then there is the potential for an increase of tax loss when they go to sale. So that, at this point, is kind of the only thing that I could see potentially on the horizon that would cause that number to start going down. And so you just kind of have to weigh, like, what do you want that, to look like? But at this point, I think that the revenue will actually go up, because I don't see as many people probably paying both installments of their taxes going forward. And at this point, we still haven't seen a ton of code abatement liens coming to my office at this point. So it's just something I, consider and kind of think about as a potential, but I haven't seen it yet.
Okay, so you're figuring that there's not a whole lot of pressure there from, and this is more of a bubble, short-term bubble,
For what?
for having the teeter at that low amount for next year.
It's a low revenue amount purely because everybody paid their taxes on time.
Thank you.
Well, not everybody, but a significant portion of people did.
All right, moving along now to overview of general fund reductions. So this just, again, broad stroke of what the reduction target was, what the actual reductions were. I had one or two areas that I was going to discuss at the end of this, but obviously if there are more specific questions on any one unit, I'd be happy to go back to or stop depending on how the board would like to deliberate on it. But so I chunked these based on alphabetical by department, with the exception of Board of Supervisors being the very first item. You can see here on the left-hand column is what the reduction target was, and then the right-hand column is their actual reduction on where they were at. The ones with arrows represent spots that we didn't achieve the full 5% for that particular unit. Again, as an aggregate, we were above the 5% reduction, but there were some units that did not meet that. In the coming slides, the Board of Supervisors is one item that I was going to bring up and ask the board for direction on once I complete this piece. Same with the community organizations and programs that's here in my budget. The other item is facilities, and I can speak to that one now. The unfortunate thing is when Patrick came through and did his summaries and work, he was at his 5%. We were going to be holding some positions, but needing to budget the janitorial service for the sheriff's admin facility is estimated, we're putting it out to RFP, so we don't know what the final cost would be, but an estimated $140,000 impact that put us back over the line in terms of what we were able to reduce in the facilities budget. So I did want to call that piece out to the board. We also did not reduce the grand jury. In fact, we increased the grand jury. And this was in part with discussions with the grand jury about some challenges they had last year, running out of funds to be able to hold meetings, just based on having a little more active grand jury, doing more meetings, more investigations. So we worked so that we weren't having to do mid-year budget adjustments or cleanup items, which we had to do a year-end cleanup item for some of them last year. Instead, we corrected that and put them back to where they ought to be for this year's expenditures. And then on county contributions, that one's a really tough one to reduce much of, because you're talking about your maintenance of efforts, you're talking about your support for a lot of internal programs or transfers for like our TOT revenues get transferred out from there. We do our 25 split to each of those organizations through that budget. Those are areas that you really can't reduce by that 5% without potentially going against what statute says or what agreements we've had thus far. The next line on the county clerk recorder, in these cases, and I made the comment at recommended budget where doing reductions was a challenge in some areas because we have very lean departments, and there aren't a lot of areas that there is room to reduce without impacting staff. And so this is one such area. In fact, in elections, there was some concern where we needed to allocate some additional funds for some projects coming up in elections specifically. And also with the county clerk, being the county clerk, there's this nexus here between county clerk and recorder that the two together provide a net offset, and it wouldn't make sense to be reducing one when the others, the other fees are supporting that. And then the museum, which is really such a small budget that there's not much to be able to reduce from the museum budget.
On elections, isn't the state backfilling the cost of the compliance with that new elections rule?
My understanding is, oh, there she is, I was going to say, do you want to speak to that a little bit? Because I know there was a reason that we needed the additional.
The state is offering, they allocated us so much money for buying a new election system. However, there would be a 50% match. So anything we spend on the election system, the county has to offer 50% match. That's not included in my budget at all at this point. That would be something, if we do go forward moving with buying a voting system, I would bring back and discuss at that point. I'm hopeful, and I put questions out to the state, as we have some HAVA funds already allocated to us, if we'd be able to use parts of those as a match so that the county isn't up for the full 50%. But we don't have the complete amount in our HAVA funds currently to even match it completely. So right now we budgeted for planning. At the time that we submitted this, we thought we were going to have a 2-page ballot. We managed to get it on a 1-page ballot. So the amount we were able to squeeze out of elections, when I talked to Tim, was concerning because we already had budgeted, because of our salary snafu, we had already budgeted really low, knowing that our salaries weren't in there correctly. And so the amount we did take back out, because we took $30,000 out when we pulled it out at recommended budget from salaries, we ended up putting back into ballot printing with the assumption we're going to have a 2-card ballot. However, we are going to have a 1-card ballot at this point. So technically we still have that $30,000. The reason being is our last election of a similar cycle. So elections run on cycles, and each cycle our costs differ depending on who's giving us money for an election. This coming election we get more money, so we're running on a different cycle. And a like election cycle, we were running at $30,000 more. So technically at this point we probably could do it without that $30,000 that we put back in. Just throwing that out there. But
Well, and I think going back to that conservative piece of, my goal was, in talking to departments, what I didn't want to see is we reduce so much that then at mid-year they're coming back and having to ask for money back, because that kind of defeats the purpose. And so I think we could leave it out there at this point. My recommendation is that it's in there. It's, certainly if something unexpected were to come up, it provides some cushion in elections. And if it's not used, it would come back as fund balance at year end.
so at this point we budgeted for nothing extra, nothing special. So if anything extra or special occurred, we do have that $30,000 cushion. But if that was pulled out, we'd be coming back at mid-year and saying, by the way, now we have this and we need more money. So, however, but yes, we were allocated funds, but they're not included here, and the county has to match it.
Rebecca, is there any risk or penalties of not meeting the requirements that they're setting, or is there a timeline they were wanting to have that done by?
No, there's no penalty. We were one of the original counties that was okay to do it
Test market.
sooner.
Right.
It has been recommended even in the grand jury report recently that we do move forward. There still are issues, one being a voting system where we know if, I don't know how far you want me to go into this, so I could take up all kinds of time if you want, but the reason we haven't moved forward yet is our voting system that we currently have would not guarantee us the ability to know that when one voter voted at a vote center, they didn't go vote at another vote center that same day. Because vote centers would be different than precinct elections. There would only be 3 of them as opposed to the 15 precincts we currently have. But at each vote center, all ballot types are available for all voters, where now if you go into a precinct, only the ballot types for that precinct are available. So to vote on your right ballot, you have to go to the right precinct. The new voting model is everybody gets mailed a vote-by-mail ballot, but we also will have vote centers open 10 days before the election, running through the weekends, and there will only be 3 of them. And at those 3, anybody who didn't get their vote-by-mail initially could go to a vote center and get it at any one of the 3, or if you just wanted to take your vote by mail to the vote center and turn it in and get a live ballot is what they're calling them, you could get a live ballot at the vote center. But the issue we're running into with our voting system is it did not provide us the ability, because right now at a precinct what we have is a paper roster, and our security to make sure nobody's voting anywhere else is they can only vote at the location that their name is on the roster. If they go anywhere else, they have to use a provisional ballot, which gives us the ability to check. Vote centers, they don't want any ballots going into envelopes. They all have to go into the counter at the vote center. And if we do that, it takes away our security knowing that somebody can't go to one vote center and then go to another vote center and vote the same day. So to fix that, we would definitely have to update the technology we're using in elections, which is the money that was allocated to us.
Okay, I just want to be sure there wasn't any financial pressure in this budget forcing us into doing this if we're not ready.
There's not, however, they do put out there very briefly that if you don't spend your money, they might take it away. So it's question of, so we've been allocated this amount of money, but if we don't use it, we still risk that they're going to take it and then allocate it to another county that may use it.
Mr. Chair. Yeah. Ma'am, Rebecca? The state program you're talking about, is this involving all 58 counties of the state?
Yes. So all 58 counties at this point.
It's mandated by law?
There's no mandate that counties move forward with the voting model. It's just highly encouraged. And so if we don't move forward, there's no penalty to us either.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Next item that I was going to highlight was on coroner and public administrator. On coroner, going back to my comment on not wanting mid-year corrections, the board will recall the last few years where we've had to come in and do a mid-year correction for the coroner. Reducing them at this point, I feel would just bring us back to the same spot where we'd be having to make an adjustment out of contingency. And the public administrator is such a small budget as it is already that there isn't really much to be able to pull back out of there. I do want to note on Ag Commissioner, so that one I had to end up increasing, and the reason is within the provisions for the Agriculture Department, it's not an MOE in the same sense as how I am accustomed to an MOE, but it is nonetheless a methodology that they use where they take, basically you have to fund them to the level over the last, and I think it was a 4-year floating period. When we did our original budget, we had already reduced them to a certain level that was actually below that threshold. So what this meant is end up having to basically put it back in for where I had reduced them going into recommended budget. So unfortunately, it's a positive piece going back against the savings that we're trying to realize. But I think based on the risk of losing a significant portion of our state and federal dollars, or mostly state dollars, over keeping the reduction, keeping the revenue was the more appealing option. And then in animal services, some of those similar challenges where, given some of the budget pressures, we did have the grand jury report. We're trying to address some of the concerns, and the shelter out at animal services, in addition to the vehicle that they needed to get for patrols. We felt that we couldn't reduce them additionally beyond the amount that they did reduce. And then on insurance, that did go up. I don't know if Judy, if you have offhand what the factors were on insurance. Is that because we had also moved the risk coordinator over into there?
Yes, we had made some changes with moving both a portion of my salary and Deb Showman's salary, and then of course we have the risk coordinator. This will change the A87, but with the time that both Deb and myself spend in the risk management, and then also the funding that we are doing with the liability insurance.
I think overall just trying to more formalize that risk function within HR and give it more attention that it needs, recognizing that the flip side is the potential of saving, costs through whether it's work comp, whether it's through just general insurance practices, and our premiums go down. There's a lot of opportunities.
Right. There's a big opportunity that we're moving toward, that we're looking at for next year. Since we have brought on a safety manager, is I guess the best way to put it. She's already getting out, assessing different work sites that issues have been brought to our attention. It was brought to our attention that we had several fire extinguishers that were out of date. She had new fire extinguishers out there immediately, and then is doing assessments of all of the different outstations. So she's putting a program together to be able to identify the different risks and then stay on top of it. We're also she will take all of the workers' comp reports for the last several years, identify trainings that need to be done, and the idea is to work toward a different model of our workers' comp insurance, so that almost more of a self-insurance for a certain amount will have a much lower premium, and then also makes us more accountable and makes our departments more accountable. So I think it will, in the long run, will save us money. It also puts programs and safety first in everybody's minds.
Thank you, Judy. Moving on next, information technology. The spot there where we did do some reductions, but again, we have a lot of fixed contracts in there just based on some of the technology contracts that we have on an ongoing basis. Those, like for instance, all of our Microsoft licenses across the county for Word and such, rather than being in the departments, typically those recurring costs are borne through the IT budget, our accounting system, our new budget system. So that number isn't just staffing. It does reflect a lot of those recurring fixed costs that would mean terminating contracts and potentially not having some of the critical services or case systems that staff are using. Moving on to the last page again is sheriff. There are no areas of note there, and just in terms of the sheriff did a tremendous job at working, identifying areas to bolster some areas or reduce others. I really appreciate that effort. I know it was a challenge and a lot of discussion, but I think, again, overall, going with that idea of managing within the department and the resources and letting our department heads make determinations on how their operations need to be and where the funds could be allocated. So unless the board has questions before I go to this next piece, which is input on a couple of areas that I wanted to bring up, we can start here if you'd like. So the first item is the Board of Supervisors budget. Again, frankly, staff, myself, didn't feel comfortable arbitrarily making reductions to the board's budget without having the board's input on something like that. So the reduction goal for 5% was $22,789. Current reduction is sitting at $12,500. There isn't, quite frankly, a lot in the board's budget to reduce. The only areas that have any kind of built-in padding for being able to use would be travel and also minor equipment. Those are the two that I kind of looked at, and for just for reference for everyone so you can see it up here. This is the board's Schedule 9, and I apologize if that's not, see if I can't boost that a little bit where people can still read it. So you can see here salaries, obviously we're not going to be able to do anything on those areas. That leaves us on the services and supplies area. And you can see this bottom line, or this far right column, really represents where we're at. Your line items that could potentially be reduced are ones that we're using pretty close on. You can see this column represents actuals for last year, so it kind of gives you a baseline. We're at 3,000 last year. On here you spent 2,864 for communication. That's going to include any connection you have with your iPad or your cell phones. The food, if we're doing a lunch meeting that comes in for a long closed session over lunch. Memberships, that includes a number of memberships, RCRC, it includes CSAC. There are about 4 or 5 that are up there, and I apologize, you all have to read this. Also, Chamber of Commerce, Mountain Counties Water Resources, Central Sierra Resources are the items that are in that memberships line for you. Then you have your office expenses. Again, that's broad office expenses for I'm sure the clerk and anything that she might be doing that might not be tied to a specific district. The district office expenses were already reduced from the 100. Special department expense. This is to purchase updated ordinance books. The ordinance books, I know the clerk can go into detail on this, but it is to the point that we don't want to be losing some of these valuable ordinance books, and they need to be preserved. Then we have travel and training, which is the one area that could be considered. You can see where it's by district. District 1 at this point is 0. District 2 is 2,000, 3, 4,500, 4, 2,000, 5, 2,000. And then last is the minor equipment that I think typically there's not a specific line item laid out for it, as much as if an iPad breaks, or if for whatever reason we need to buy equipment. So last year we did use it, but I think that one kind of can ebb and flow. The year prior, you had some computers, but not nearly as much. So those things can kind of ebb and flow. So those were my comments for the board to deliberate on.
Shouldn't mountain counties be flipped over into the same category as eastern San Joaquin groundwater?
You know, certainly wouldn't be a bad idea. When I get to the next item, that's actually something that I'm going to highlight in terms of, we put eastern groundwater there. We also put UMRA there and community organizations. So that certainly would be one. I mean, that's a good cleanup item, but it's just moving dollar from here to there. But yes, it would certainly, it would help.
Were you finding, Supervisor Garamendi, you're doing RCRC, and you're feeling that the $1,600 that you spent last year was sufficient to,
For the membership?
no, to take care of your travel expenses?
Yeah, most of that was going up to the conference.
Okay.
So I'm not even sure, did I spend, was there 1,600 spent on that?
1725.
I don't think that was, actually, you know what that was? That was, I think, training. I think that was.
Training?
New orientation.
New orientation.
New orientation, CSAC.
So the question would be then amongst the board members is, you know, is that too much, or do you think that we could reduce that to 1,500 for the year, or 1,000 for the year?
Don't intend to go to new supervisor training again, so absolutely, that one. RCRC pays their own way,
Okay.
yeah, no problem. But if you take 1,000 off mine, no problem at all.
So if we just drew a $1,000 number on each person there instead of what we have now, that would be adequate?
Certainly for my district, yes. I can't speak for the rest of you guys.
Okay. I'm just starting a conversation, so.
Yeah, no, I'm good with that.
I have to make you aware that some of the travel involved with CSAC and NACO, those are high dollar items, and we have to get the benefit of that membership. In addition to those costs, or the membership costs to belong to those organizations. Those benefits include reduction on insurance, being part of several programs with CSAC, and of course their political influence. I don't know if I could reduce that by $1,000, but at a budget of $4,500 now. I know that is an expensive deal.
Can you scroll down so I can see the column titles again?
Up here, you mean?
Yeah.
So this one is what the actual was for last year. This is what is currently in the system, and this one is just from what the board approved at preliminary budget.
Scroll down to travel. Because I remember the CSAC training was not last year, it was the year before, it was 17.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I can't imagine where that would have come from. It's the only thing I can imagine.
So would be 1,500 be reasonable?
It might have been, the series, yeah, no problem at all. I think it might have been the series, there was that.
Oh, that's right,
The
that's
monthly,
right.
when we went down and learned our trade.
Well, I would be willing to reduce District 4 down to 1,500. I don't think that'd be a problem. Or even 1,000 wouldn't
I'm
be a
sorry,
problem.
did you say 1,500 or 1,000?
1,500 wouldn't be a problem. 1,000 really wouldn't be a problem if the board concurs that everyone is at that number, and you've,
I've given back all of mine, $2,500, so.
I mean, we're assuming that the committees stay the same. If the committees stay the same, then I could give back $1,500, bring mine down to 1,000. Because RCRC pays the mileage.
and in my case with mountain counties, that's probably my single greatest expense outside of the trips to Stockton, to eastern San Joaquin, et cetera. Those are my two big ones as far as out of county. So I could get by with 1,000 and just absorb the rest. It wouldn't be a problem.
Same here.
I wish I could say that, being a representative for NACO and CSAC. Those are pretty expensive.
I think you got a different situation, Mike.
I also would add one more consideration, and it's those unknowns of the unknowns on, for instance, if depending on the election this November, if you have any new supervisors that are then having to go up to new supervisor orientation again, that cost pops, back up and comes into play. And I think for me, part of the exercise and the challenge is truthfully looking at budgets across counties. This board budget is very lean, and I think the fact that you guys are having the struggle going through and trying to identify where to reduce is part of the challenge that we have in a lot of areas. So I do also want to note that we do run the risk of then having to come back, and if something goes wrong, something unanticipated comes up, we have to pull from contingencies to fund it back up.
So would it be better to establish a contingency account for travel, that should there be some changes in supervisor positions, that we already have a buffer in there to play with?
I mean, you would normally do that by just budgeting it under that line
All right.
that you would have, yeah.
But I'm willing to go to 1,000 on mine.
See,
Jack, same?
I'm fine with that 1,000, but I do think that going to the CSAC stuff is important, so I think we have to have some flexibility for people who've got further travels.
And I agree. We don't want to limit our representation amongst various organizations that we're in simply because we feel that we're obligated personally to the expenses of being there.
So there we go, we got $4,000.
I heard Clyde, Jack, and Dennis.
No, mine's already out of it.
Yeah, I was
Mine
gonna
was
say-
part of the 12,000 that we came up to.
Supervisor Vera, I'm sorry.
Again, going back to line item 5411, last year we only expended $1,868, and we had 4,602 in the budget. This year, at preliminary, we were at 10. Now, with the reduction of 1,000, we're at 9. Is that an area that we can reduce? Because I'm just looking at the history of where
I find that questionable. We did already pay into, we've already done 1,600. We're at 1,670 of the ordinances right now. So we've already spent roughly 9,000. So this might need a journal correction, or I don't know if it's worth going back now. That money was spent.
This is from last year, though.
That was last year, and it
last year.
was
That's
spent, because we started the project last year, and the first bill was roughly $9,000. I have the books in my office as proof, if you guys want to come see them. But at that same point, that is with, we took the old ordinance books. Most of them, well, they started in 1850, and they were falling apart. And so the oldest ones have already been replaced, and we're continuing the process. As we're doing this, so you know, we're indexing the ordinances. So everything through 1670 has been, Ordinance 1670 has been indexed so far, and we're still working on it. So soon that will be available for everyone to search ordinances. And we're indexing them not only by ordinance number, but we're indexing them by what department they impacted, what the overall subject of the ordinance was, and we're even putting in what supervisors voted on them, so that they will be findable when we're done, because I don't want any more of we can't find ordinances happening. So it's a positive project, it's an expensive project, but it will end eventually. But I do think it's to the overall county benefit that we don't lose our ordinance books, and that we're able to find them as they're the county's laws.
Okay, thank you.
I did want to note, I don't know if you guys want this input, I have a note that I reduced minor equipment by $2,300 based off previous year expenses. Being it was higher last year, I'm assuming everybody doesn't need new equipment this year, and so I did reduce it by $2,300 there. And I also noticed that the office expense 5263 was not reduced with the rest of them I reduced. It's only $50, but that's the difference I saw from what I thought it should have been.
You're talking about this broad office expense?
No,
was at $950 to $500.
5263 should be $50.
Oh. Oh,
Because
one
Got
didn't
everybody
do it.
else.
Yeah.
the only reason I noticed is because I showed your overall reductions to be 14,850 as opposed to the 12,500.
So right now, it's opposed to 12,500, it's 14,000. Your comment again?
It's 14,850 is what I had as total reductions. And the reason I came up with that amount, you guys might think this is pretty silly, but I didn't think it was silly, as when everybody, the rest of the county employees got a 2% increase, you voted not to increase your salary by 2%. So I used that 14,850 plus the roughly 8,000 in salary savings to justify your 5%. So technically on paper, you don't see that, but that was my rationale at coming up with the 14,850.
And the reason I didn't factor that in and include that was consistency on our methodology. We had a number of departments that came in and said, hey, at recommended budget, you'll recall where we started and we did some reductions. They all said, hey, we gave up staff positions, we gave up, this and that. So we were holding everybody to the 5% on top of where they started, which was the only reason in terms of methodology why I hadn't counted that.
I think that's fair. You can't count it. You can't count that. You're right, but, gentlemen, we should have taken it. We could have given it back right now. Moved on to the next item.
So I guess the only real one that I kind of had out there was whether you want to go ahead and reduce this minor equipment, and if you want to bring it down to 2,000, 1,000, somewhere around there.
$2,500 ought to be happy to.
Okay.
23? Didn't you say 23?
I had reduced it by 23, but that doesn't mean anything.
So that would leave it as a 2,700 balance.
2,700?
From 5,000 down to 2,700.
Okay, so that's $2,300. Okay, $2,300. Going once? Is everybody okay with that?
Yeah.
Okay, so we have $2,300 there, and we have a reduction of District 5, District 4, and District 2 going down to $1,000 on their expenses. So that brings it to 5,000.
And District 3, Mr. Chair, was at 5,000,
It's at 4,500 at this
4,500.
point.
4,500? Does that cover NACO and CSAC? Do you recall?
It would, yeah.
I think we did. We were under that. Okay, we can do that.
That would be where it would pay from, whether that covers it,
Well, I've got to be honest, after the last CSAC and NACO conventions, prices are going up for lodging. I mean, it was like, if you're going to be attended, it's getting quite expensive.
Brings us 5,300 plus the 12,500 that's already reduced.
And my suggestion then at this point, if I may, I don't know that we'll be able to close that gap entirely based on this without wholesale whacking lines out. And I do have a concern that it creates challenges for the board to be able to do general business when it comes to office expenses, or if it comes to, things for legal notices or travel that this board's budget is very lean. You don't have staff assigned to it, devoted just for a board rep or anything else, that there isn't a whole lot to trim back.
Tim, we're just going to go, and since we don't have enough money for pins or pads and paper, we'll just steal them out of your.
Yes.
Water.
But then my budget goes up, see?
That's your
You got
problem.
pins and pads we can use?
Box of cards for $50.
I didn't know we had pins and pads. I've been using my own.
All right, well, are we good at the 5,300 here on this item and move on to the next?
I just want to add, so when we reduce it, it's like when I see it go over for real, I'm going to be the person having to say,
Yes.
sorry guys, you don't have any money. And so either that puts me in a position of coming back at mid-year and asking to increase that budget, or just telling you, sorry, you can't buy that pen. And I don't love being in that position, but I just want that to be a reminder, like, I'm not trying to be the bad guy. I am just doing my job.
We won't
Okay.
hold you, we'll hold each other.
The question I got is, how come I get $50 for business cards and Todd gets 100?
That's what it was supposed to be reduced. His was supposed to be 52.
Yeah, we just corrected it.
There we go, we're at 53.50.
He has thick card stock and you have thin card stock. All right, moving on.
So the next org that I wanted to draw attention to, community organizations and programs, that's another unit that I did not, really was not able to reduce from that 5% perspective. The target would have been $13.99. Our current reduction is $15.51. And if you go through what's actually on that budget, and I'll show you.
Tim, are you sure Eastside GSA is going to require $10,000 this coming year, budget year? I thought that was a one-time.
I don't believe so, but
A
Brian,
one-time payment.
if Brian's around, he could answer that question.
Well, I was in the meeting when it went on. So
Okay.
I'm simply saying is we gave them a one-time payment to meet the obligations for the portion of the grant. And that was to carry us through to the end of the project at 2020. So I'm not so certain that we're going to be owing that $10,000.
Well, I'm looking over at Krista, who maybe can go grab Brian and find out to see if he can
Go
answer
over
the
to Boston,
question.
see what page that is on that.
Yes, sorry, that is page, I'm at page 230 in your budget books. So this shows you from the perspective of what's in that budget. This is a snapshot. You can see there's not very many items on here. And so that's why I kind of put together the slide to give you a better picture of what's in the contracted services. So professional services within that line, that's your larger line item, includes your UC co-op extension contract. That is a contract, and that one cannot be reduced. And in fact, they've been asking us for additional funds for their move into the RCD building for utilities and phones and internet. That is putting pressures on there where clearly we're not wanting to increase this budget, but I definitely know that we're really not in a position to be able to decrease it. The other items in there, $3,500 to San Andreas Senior Center is an item, $10,000 to Eastside San Joaquin Groundwater Agency, and Brian's in here to maybe speak to whether or not that $10,000 is expected again or not.
Good afternoon, Brian Moss, Administrative Office. Actually, I would plan on having that in there. I'm going to be attending the East San Joaquin Groundwater Basin meeting tomorrow as well, and I will confirm that. I have not heard one way or the other. Supervisor Mills, have you? And Eric's,
It's a one-time payment.
It's a one-time-
to initiate, so that
Okay.
we could cover our portion of the
Oh,
grant.
yes.
And the grant was for the full amount.
Yes.
To make the planning requirements through 2020.
right,
January 2020.
Right.
So we've done that, and that's what we literally had months of allocation discussions.
correct,
And
correct.
this was our portion of that allocation for the grant. The grant is there now.
Okay.
We've been approved.
Very good. Thank you for that, because I was thinking this was actually something else as far as just ongoing cost of the basin, but absolutely, thank you for reminding me that it would
And-
be correct. And I will still confirm that.
Please do, but their facilitator stepped away, so they're no longer paying for the
Correct.
cost of the facilitator.
Correct.
And also, San Joaquin County is paying for the expenses of the meeting hall and the location
Right.
work that's done there.
Right, including tomorrow's meeting.
Yes.
Yes, thank you.
Just confirm it, and if
I
I'm right,
will
then we can
definitely
pull that
confirm that.
10,000 out.
Yes, definitely confirm that tomorrow. Thank you.
From that, and I just got a note that another staff person said they thought was lower, but it was around 5,000. So if we could get a confirmation on that and build that into the budget.
I think Supervisor Mills is correct. I think it was a one-time thing when we were putting it together with CCWD, Rock Creek Water District, and San Joaquin County. So, thank you.
Brian. The next item, 2,400 for Murphy's Masonic Hall, 5,000 San Andreas Cemetery District, 6,920 to Central Sierra Economic Development, 15,000 to Common Ground Senior Services, and then 11,000 for UMRA. So again, I think all of these have been contributions, some necessary based on agreements that we've entered into, such as something like the San Joaquin Groundwater Basin, if it in fact is going to have a cost to us. But otherwise or UMRA would be another example. But then others are more community driven, and it's kind of a policy decision from the board's perspective on if any of those organizations would be asked to take a reduction in proportion to what our county services are also taking.
So to get to what Supervisor Mills came up with and then this reduction, we're $2,448 short of the 5%.
For this one, you can see the slide up there. The goal was $1,399, so we already reduced that by $1,500.
Minus 10.
Yeah,
Minus 10.
assuming 10. Yeah, assuming the 10. Yeah.
Where would you pull the other 2,500 from?
I took $1,399 minus $1,551 minus 10.
That's where you would take it.
Oh,
Yeah.
there's a question, I'm sorry.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just trying to figure out where, if we're going to take an additional piece, where we're going to get it from.
I would say I'm in favor of doing it just like that. With the quote for 2,400. I don't think you're going to reduce UMRA.
No.
You're taking anything else to take away from community.
We get a lot of benefit out of UMRA, even though it may not be visually,
No, we're getting millions.
we're getting millions out of it, so.
Okay.
Okay.
Move on.
Yes. So then, assuming that, going back to my list before, unless the board has another budget at this point, I mean, certainly we can deliberate more afterward, but if there's another budget specifically you'd like to talk about now, or I have about 4 more slides left and can be done with this presentation.
Let's go through what you've got.
So then the last piece is really revisiting our equity increases. The board will recall at recommended budget, we brought a few equity adjustments for unrepresented employees. At the time, the board asked that we defer that, bring it back at final budget. Judy, I believe, has handouts for, or at least a discussion item for what those were. In summary, what you see up there is kind of the cost estimates for each of the departments that those adjustments would be in, and Ms. Hawkins, I think, has copies to show exactly what those are.
So the sheet that's coming around right now is the item that we bring back once the budget is approved, kind of summarizing the equity increases approved, all of the different changes. And on top of this sheet is the equities that I had brought to you at recommended budget. And we have broken these out into broken them out into, in some cases, 2 different increases. So we're recommending a 5% increase for the first full pay period after board adoption. And some of these positions are vacant. It is just so that they are properly paid when we look at the classifications. So the administrative.
Do you want to, I'm sorry, Judy, do you want to specify vacant? You should also specify there is not even
There
a
is
position that
nobody
exists.
in the position.
Or the position doesn't technically exist right now unless someone underfills it.
Right. We have it within our classifications, but nobody is in the positions. And so it is not drawing any funds from the general fund.
I guess then the question has to be, what's the potential?
For these positions,
On those ones that we just talked about?
Yes.
Typically, when you're doing that, it's an underfill. So I know 2 examples here would be the admin analyst, or 3 examples, admin analyst, senior admin analyst, and the principal analyst. Say one of my deputy CAO positions were vacant, and I decided to underfill it. In effect, you're actually having a cost savings because you're underfilling a higher level position. But what this is doing is cleaning up and reconciling from the department analyst positions that were created at recommended versus administrative analyst positions that are only for the county administrative office.
Getting a balance.
Yeah, so typically if you're doing it, it's because you're underfilling it. If you don't have it on the books, unless you're going to the board and requesting the position, in which case the board would see what that total cost is.
one of the positions that is a possibility that we are working toward is the Deputy Ag Commissioner. We currently have somebody that is underfilling that position and is working toward getting all of the certifications to fill that position. So we're hoping in the next year to be able to fill the position as a Deputy Ag Commissioner. So that's a good example of one in probably a year out would be filled.
Okay, thank you.
So and I have included, I know that you were given the costs, but I've also included the costs on the very last sheet for the equity increases. And so going down the list, we have recommended administrative analyst for a 5% increase, assistant auditor controller, business analyst 3, deputy ag commissioner, the network specialist manager, senior administrative analyst, the ag commissioner, administrative compliance analyst, county veterans services officer, facilities and grounds manager, principal analyst, and senior code enforcement officer. Those positions, like I said, would receive a 5% increase after the first full pay period after board adoption. And then a 4% equity increase has been recommended for the road superintendent, the first full pay period after board adoption. An additional 5% increase for the January 5th, 2019 for the positions of Ag Commissioner, Business Analyst 3, Assistant Auditor Controller, and Senior Code Enforcement Officer, and then additional 4% effective January 5th for the Road Superintendent. And then the total of these increases for fiscal year 18-19 would be $135,371.
I don't see on your back page, you have the second item, 3407. I don't see it listed here.
Assistant Chief Probation Officer, 3407.
Yeah,
You don't
Okay.
have it on your page?
I don't see it
Second
on
item.
this front page.
It's there.
We have already passed the increases for, that has already been approved. I brought that to you at the previous board meeting. We have passed the increases for the Assistant Chief Probation Officer and supervising probation, deputy probation officer.
Was that our last meeting?
Yes. And so those are not being brought before you for consideration.
So we can subtract those numbers out of
Yes.
135? Okay, that's what I was,
Which makes a big difference, actually.
yeah, it makes a tremendous amount of difference, about 50 grand, a little over 50 grand.
And I believe the total for the equities is, I think, 73,000 when you take out the probation piece.
Yeah, it's gonna be around that, and it's a little over 50,000 from the 135, so.
Tim,
Yes.
so as we look down the road at future budgets, if we went through any sort of freeze, these vacant positions would be frozen, correct?
Most definitely, if they're even on the books. Like I said, some of these positions,
I'm not a big fan
using
of parking
vacant,
positions.
vacant next to here is kind of a misnomer because the position doesn't, we don't actually have an allocation for it. It's still on our position list that.
This is the parking lot thing.
Well, it's not even a parking lot. It's, so the board adopts classifications for all positions within the county. That doesn't mean that you always have an allocation for one of those positions. But rather than try and clean it up when you have to use it, keeping it fresh, clean, pulling stuff off that that you anticipate you're no longer going to use, or keeping the salary updated is important. The only time it becomes relevant then is if you're underfilling something to that position.
Right, this would just be updating the salary range for those classifications. There is not a position control number associated with them.
Is this $73,000 increase baked into this budget? No.
It is my understanding that the departments did put the equity increases into their budget.
Can you give me an example? Can you give me an example of
Looking
that?
over to, yeah, I'm looking over for, do we know that definitively or not? I would need to verify that statement.
Because I know I talked with several of the, I've talked with the building department, I've talked with several departments, but
Sabrina's shaking her head. Rick, you did too? Rebecca, you did?
But I did it not staggered. I did effective, sorry. When I did the calculation for the equity adjustments, I didn't stagger it out. I did it effective once the board, that's the first pay period effective after the board approved it for final. Just because I manage payroll. It takes a tremendous amount of time to stagger and kind of dole out these compensation increases. It impacts my office, it impacts HR, it impacts our IT for our business administrator, and sometimes I wonder if that staggering costs more time and effort than what we would have saved if we had just gone ahead and tore the Band-Aid off and done what we needed to do at the point we needed to do it. Just throwing my 2 cents out there.
What becomes a nightmare is when you retro.
Please never retro.
I'm just simply saying
Yeah.
that there should be a policy that
We
says no
have
retro.
retroed, and that's even worse than staggering it out. But there is a tremendous amount of work of having to stagger these things out, because every time we stagger, we have to have the salary grade updated, and we have to change the pay assignment, and then we have to test all of that, and then we have to, it's just a lot of administration to try to stagger these out. So my preference is always agree to what it needs to be, rip the Band-Aid off, make it effective on that day, and move forward.
I agree.
So, just so I'm clear, Tim, you're asking us to, what we're being asked to do is approve these equity increases, which are already baked into the, as far as we know, baked into
Yeah,
this
and
current
I'm going
budget.
through and checking here on my screens and seeing them
So it
baked
could
into
be an
there.
increase, it's somewhere between $0 and $73,000 increase.
The it's 73,000, I just had it in
Yeah,
front of me.
we'll round.
And it's $73,240.55.
So if every department did what folks in the back said they did, we're good. It's
It's
zero.
in their budget.
We just need to confirm it, that every
So,
department did.
When we did this in June, we said we'll bring this back and discuss whether we want to do this, and everybody went ahead and did it anyway.
Well, anticipate, they
Yeah.
ware just anticipating.
Yeah, put this
Get it in
back
there.
in the budget for whether or not it comes or not.
Well, I'm glad we got to say it.
So I heard Sabrina say it was built into code. I'm not seeing it necessarily as a line item in the code budget. Perhaps, do you know offhand where it might have been placed? Okay. Because that's the one spot that I'm not seeing it from this list right now.
Any other board questions? We need to take a poll.
Yeah, the idea behind having the discussion now is last year we had it late enough and I felt it was important that if we're going to make the adjustments, we can pull it out now.
Well, if we take a poll now, either yay or nay, when it comes back for our approval, we're not approving this today, we're giving direction. It'll be in it or it'll be out of it when it comes back to final. So,
And that decision will be made when we come back?
On the 25th.
we approve it.
23rd.
But we're given direction now, so I want to poll the board whether they're okay with this moving forward to see it in the final budget or not. So you go yay or nay, Supervisor Clapp.
I don't know, it seems like we're taking from one hand and giving to the other. It's like,
Your mic, sir.
there you go. Yes.
Supervisor Mills.
Yes, this is not difficult.
No.
No? Supervisor Alvera? Or no? Supervisor Garamendi?
I'm sorry, I could not hear anything after Supervisor Mills. Did you?
Supervisor Alvera said no.
Okay, thank you.
Supervisor Garamendi's thinking about it.
Thinking about it, what do you want to hear?
This has already been-
I'll say yes. I'll say yes. And it gives me time when it comes back to final budget. But we'll go forward right now. Directly go forward. If we have some things in final budget to talk about.
Well, can I just, that makes me a little nervous.
I know it does. That's why.
So for final budget, there isn't really time at that point to go back and make adjustments unless we take a long break, and then we're going to have to make a lot of changes, including the download that comes back to the budget system that prints everything up. So that's why I kind of wanted to have this discussion now, so we didn't, when we get to final, have a problem of having to pull it back out.
Would the better answer be, or the better question be, if all of the departments did what we said happened? The answer is yes. If they didn't, then no.
I like that.
We've got to have some discussion.
That is very helpful.
That
I
was the
like
basis of my poll.
And I would concur that. I would concur with that.
Okay. That one's good, that's good direction, and I can definitely.
Now it's left to you, Mr. Garamendi.
If I could just make a point, I still have a couple more years on this board. In the future, when we say we're going to bring things back to discuss, let's not bake them into the budget. Let's discuss them so we could do an add or subtract with that. Because right now, we don't know who's in and who's out. So it's difficult. It doesn't lead to a healthy discussion of this board.
I'm going to have to agree with Supervisor Garamendi on that. Board gave direction. And apparently it was baked into the budget, apparently not saying it so, you're gonna go back and find out and let us know when it comes back in final, but if it hasn't been baked in, then it's a no.
Right.
If it has been baked in, then we'll go
Yeah.
forward. But I'm in agreement, total agreement, Supervisor Garamendi.
And I definitely see the point. That's an excellent point. So the next one, which is not baked into the budget, so we can piece that out up front, is the equity adjustments for elected department heads. So for this, it's a bit of history. The auditor, controller, assessor, treasurer, tax collector, and clerk recorder, all except the treasurer, tax collector who's on vacation, are here today, I know, to participate in this discussion. These are the salaries that we're particularly looking at. The salaries historically have been tied together, at least for the last 15 or so years. There's nothing in the ordinance that requires them to be linked together. There has been some, well, actually, there's been quite a bit of discussion with human resources, county administration, and these departments on we need to do something on, whether it's breaking these apart and normally we're probably the only county in the state that pays all of them at that same level. But it's difficult because you have 58 counties and 58 different organizational structures of those positions. So HR and county administration has been working with those departments, and there's somewhat of a disparity or a gap on what the group feels their compensation adjustments ought to be versus what HR and administration are looking at. We try to follow uniform standards. Our normal comparison counties: Amador, Tuolumne, San Benito, Tehama, Lake, Yuba, Sutter, Yolo, San Joaquin, and Fresno. That's the most encompassing list. It's the same list we use when we do our union negotiations. For the sake of consistency, we felt it was important to use that as the starting place. What the challenges are is some of those have a auditor that's combined with treasurer, or an assessor that's combined with clerk. Some have them broken apart. So it's really difficult to start making direct comparisons. And from my perspective, I think both sides are certainly engaged at the table and can continue to have the discussion. But I felt because we have devoted quite a bit of time and energy into this before we continued to do this, given that we were already here at budget hearings, felt it was important for us to sit down and discuss kind of here's where we're at, here's kind of the range that we're looking at. Is this something that the board would like to see brought back and reflected in the budget? On this next slide, you can see kind of where the left side includes where where county, our traditional salary survey came back with and recommended. The right side is where the elected group has kind of provided information for making their case. Obviously, there's enough of a disparity here and a lot of back and forth questions that, and before we spent more time and resources on this, it was important to get the board's weigh in. And if the board wishes, we can continue down this road to try and bring something back for the 25th.
Just so I understand, so this column on the right is what our elected officials presented, and the one on the left is what our county survey came back with.
Yeah, that's what, like, HR through their salary survey process and comparisons made a recommendation on.
So I think what I want to add here is that the one thing that we can all agree on, whether it's HR, administration, all of the four of us department heads, is that our compensation does not jive with there is a disparity internal to our own county, and then there's a disparity regardless which side you look at or what you look at or what level you look at in comparison to our counterparts in other jurisdictions. And I think, you know, what we also can all agree on is it's not appropriate that department heads are making less than mid-managers. And when you look at our salary grade, we, aside from the librarian and the coroner, are 4 of the lowest paid department heads, and we have some of the highest responsibilities to the entire county constituency and the county as a whole. And we have a lot of responsibilities and experience requirements, education requirements, and liability, personal liability. And so that is not the same for a mid-manager. And so when you look at the salary grade compared to what a mid-manager is doing and look at what we are doing, there is a disparity there. Regardless of whether you look at the right side or the left side of this, that's a problem. And what we're concerned with is our salaries are creating a ceiling in our department that means we can't build succession within our department. And we can't get people to come and work in our departments and then move up to our level at some point because we have created this cap on compensation. And so, you know, we're kind of looking at, well, what do we do to retain? And that's a big issue with me on my assistant auditor controller. The salary survey that HR and administration came up with was a 30% gap. There was no arguing that. And we're not asking for a 30% equity adjustment. And she's not getting a 30% equity adjustment, even if the board approves the equity adjustment that was put forward. But she is in my place taking care of my department if I'm out of the office, and she's one of the lower paid mid-managers. So, you know, it's just kind of, I guess we would ask to stop looking at us as elected department heads. We are department heads who happen to be elected, but we have very extensive responsibilities and oversight in each of our respective departments. And just like you are having to look at non-elected department heads and determining if their salaries are appropriate, if you're going to be able to recruit appropriately for that position, we would ask that we just get the same in return. And we're not even asking for, you know, what any of us think we're valued at, what we think we're worth. We're just asking for equity, and we're asking for you to recognize that and at least give some parity to what we're doing and help, I guess, get rid of the equity issue that we are experiencing at this point within our salary grade.
So let me get this straight so that I can understand it. How many different steps are there in your classification currently?
1, A step, that's what we get.
So when we are doing salary surveys with other counties, are all of them in a single step classification, or are they multiple steps?
A majority of the counties are a single step. There are some counties that are not. And so based on what we can see in the salary surveys that HR and administration put together, they just, in any of the counties where there would have been other steps, they only used their A step to our A step. So it's kind of ignored that any other respective county would go to E or G. They just compare their A to our A.
Were there pay rate differentials for length of service in some of those counties?
Pay rate differentials for what?
Length of service?
Oh, absolutely. So what's the county? Yuba? Yuba County, the moment you step through the door, is a 21-point-something% longevity rate if you're elected. We're not asking for that. We're just asking for put equity back in treating us like department heads and pay us as department heads, because right now that's not what we're getting.
I've often been reminded of, tell me the numbers you want to hear and then I'll find them for you. But, you know, we have to be sure that we're comparing, we have a true comparison and we're just not working on a single step, single cost per hour, which is what I'm hearing. If that's not correct, then somebody correct me. But
Well, I will say that the elected provided salary survey that our in-house assessor appraiser, which, you know, it's kind of interesting. She said, you know, doing a salary survey is like doing a property appraisal. You know, you're taking the various factors and you're making appropriate comparisons. So it is a somewhat similar, timely, or you know, takes a lot of time to do it. But so she actually put the elected provided salary survey together based on the information that she got, and she did take into consideration the fact that certain counties are not like our county, and so those she pulled off. And then she did take into consideration that there are counties that do certain different longevity steps for electeds or different benefits, or they don't just go to A step, they might go A to E or A to G. So she did take all that in consideration, where the county salary survey may have included a couple different counties that hers didn't include, and also would have cut the A step to A step. So just A to A as opposed to our A to their E.
the point being, though, is the level of training that's required in your position or in Ms. Davis's position is pretty substantial. It isn't like somebody could just walk off the street and be qualified to do that job.
You wouldn't want that, and so that was one of the reasons why I brought the qualifications to office, was to ensure that, you know, we can always maintain the highest level of experience and education, breadth of knowledge that we possibly can for my office. In the case of the assessor's office, being a constitutional officer, she also has requirements for her office for certification, which is all embedded in the code. So where we have been able to pull requirements, you know, we have. So, but, you know, I will say, you know, us four department heads are, you know, just, I've been here since 2006, and, you know, Rebecca has been here a little bit before that. And we probably are some of the most passionate department heads of these respective departments that this county has ever had. We are, you know, we're very involved. We recognize what our responsibilities are to the county and this constituency. We stay apprised of every educational opportunity, every certification opportunity, every point that we possibly can in being here and being involved and being a working department head. And we're just asking for you to please recognize that and to just put some equity here. And just I think we get stuck on this idea that we're electeds. And so we signed up for this job. We knew what the pay was when we ran for office. And so just, you know, move along. My role as auditor controller has changed drastically from when I first took office, and it absolutely is completely different from when my predecessor was in office. It's a different role, and I would say that my other department heads would probably say the same thing. We've taken on a lot more responsibility than what our predecessors took on, and also what we initially signed up for.
So the level of investment that each of you have had, because you ran for elective office, is creating some stability and longevity, which then should translate into a financial advantage, if you want to call it that, to the rest of the county's organization.
It should, but and again, it's opening up the compensation level so that we can ensure that we can, I guess, you know, Judy Hawkins, the HR manager, brought up an interesting point in the department head meeting on Monday, which is we're having a really difficult time recruiting for positions. I had an opening in my office, and trying to recruit for that has been trying. And so she said, you know, you guys are going to have to think of how do you grow from within. And if I have to grow from within, how do I retain the staff that I have when the salary is capped? And I know that they can go, to counties that aren't that far away and make significantly more money, or even go across the hallway and make more money and have less responsibility. So those are the things that I have to consider, and we each have to consider in terms of making sure that our department is properly staffed, and how do we retain and how do we grow within, but also how can we get people from the outside that would even want to run for these offices. It's trying times to run for elected office and to try to stay in elected office and to try to do our jobs. There's a lot of scrutiny in it. So we kind of, from that perspective, know what we signed up for, but on the day-to-day, because we are passionate and we understand what our responsibilities are and what our role is, just recognize we are department heads and we happen to be elected.
Rebecca? Sorry. Can you tell me in column A and column B what the total increase per year is?
There's no money.
I have that here that I can tell you. So the calculation for column A, if you want to call it the county salary survey piece, the additional increases will cost $49,861, and then under option 2, $94,682.
Is that,
94,682.
is any of these four up for longevity increases this year or next during this budget year?
Well, I'm going to just add one tidbit that you and Jack are not going to be happy with, but here's my answer. The other caveat to this is, in the discussions with administration, when we asked, how do we want to do this? Because remember that my assistant auditor controller, the intention was actually to have that included with recommended budget, and it got overlooked. And so the recommendation was to calculate, and this was the instructions to the assessor and myself, was to calculate what those equity adjustments would be, and include them in the budget. So I included my equity adjustment based on the county's salary survey, not on Leslie's. And I included the equity adjustments for my assistant, and that was inclusive of PERS, that was inclusive of our existing longevity, that was inclusive of an additional Medicare taxes, and I also incorporated the 5% reduction in my budget, even with those additional costs.
Just so I'm clear, so you calculated when the budget we were just looking at, a salary increase to you of 21%?
Yes.
Wow, okay, thanks. What is the, did you guys get a 2% increase this year, like
Yes.
everybody else? And what is your salary?
It's 52.
No, what's your annual salary, please?
I don't know with the longevity. I would have to look it up.
Give me a ballpark.
I think it's 100 and it's 108, 110.
108,000? That's your take-home? That's your?
No,
No, that's all in.
Okay, that's all in.
that's
Your
gross.
plus benefits. Okay. And what is it for the assessor annually, please?
I think she is, are you the same longevity or you're? She's got longer
So
longevity.
what is it?
Could you come to the mic, please?
I can answer your guys' question if it will save some time.
It's okay. What, that's assessor.
So
They're
mine,
pitching.
since I have 2.5% higher, is about 117. A little bit plus or minus. And by the way, I baked mine in as well to the budget, since that's the word you're using.
Yeah.
Only I used my calculations, not HR's. Because
So
at
you-
that point, I did not know what HR's numbers were. And in fact, just got a formal email from Tim yesterday with those numbers.
So you increased in your budget, your salary by 31%?
Absolutely. And I can explain how we did it, but can I go one step
It's
further
okay.
on that?
Can I get the rest of them? I'm sorry, Madam Assessor, I just want to make sure I got my numbers. Does anybody know what the treasurer tax collector gets paid?
She would be at the same number I am. She has 16 years of longevity, so she and I would both be at the 7.5% longevity. The two Rebeccas would be at the same number because they both have 12 years, so they would both be at the 10% longevity.
So that's clerk recorder's at 117 also?
5%, yeah.
And did the treasurer tax collector, as far as we know, bake in her
No.
11% or 26?
No, neither the treasurer tax collector or the clerk recorder did.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, I think we have conflicting information. No offense, but Rebecca's
Well,
shaking her head, no, no, no. Maybe we gotta let her
I want
speak.
to add two things. if
Let's
I
let her
could.
speak.
I wonder-
She's here, she can speak.
Let Leslie finish her.
All right.
After we finish this and we're in the middle of preparing for budget hearings, we had a conversation among ourselves. Rebecca Turner went out and did her own evaluation and has one on her particular position that differs slightly. She actually found where at least one county that I used had a higher rate. They had a salary increase between the time I did my survey and the time she did her survey, which I believe has been in the last 2 or 3 days. Secondly, I did talk to Judy earlier today because this was coming forward, and as again, I said, we didn't have the benefit of knowing what Judy's recommendation is or where she got it. And what I said to her today was this: I think we need to sit down on the actual numbers, and we need to talk about who did what with the numbers. But in order to get to that point, what we're asking is that your board agree that an equity adjustment is appropriate. We can move forward. We can bring it back to you on September 25th. So Rebecca Turner can talk to you about what her results were.
And for clarification, Rebecca Callen was in meetings, was given this information, so I don't know what was or wasn't shared by the group, so I can't attest for what you got at various times.
And that's fair and that's fine. It's just where we are now.
Yeah, I just want to make a clarification that both Rebecca's, Callan and Turner, are at 108
Before longevity.
before longevity. So they're 12, and they have 12. You have,
And we have, so we'd have 5% longevity,
you're at 5%.
year or two? Yeah. Yeah.
So, so it'd be a $22,000 raise to you and roughly a $36,000 raise to Leslie? It's a good raise.
And that would put us higher than non-mid managers.
I understand.
So I guess I would respectfully ask that if you want to know what we're getting paid, that you would also ask what the mid managers are getting paid for far less work than and responsibility than what we're doing.
We're just talking about
I know.
where we're at right now.
And Rebecca Turner and the treasurer tax collector were not aware of what the numbers were, and that wasn't part of the discussion when administration and HR met, so they did not include anything with regards to equity adjustments in their budgets.
So I just want to add that I wasn't aware of any of this until about a week ago, that there was even salaries being discussed. But because they were, and I wanted to see for myself, the clerk recorder, what it was being compared to, because the clerk recorder has the most diverse of any of the departments. From you could be the clerk recorder, you could be the clerk recorder ROV, you could be the clerk recorder ROV, board of the clerk of the board. And so I just wanted to define the difference between what my department is and what the comparables were. So I went ahead and did my own study. And again, I'm not asking for a raise or not. I just, if they're going to go forward with this, I just want to make sure that my position is looked at comparatively to other counties of the same positions. So when I did my own study, aside, so there's been 3 salary studies done here, by the way, I looked at it, and what I saw, and I tried to stick to what the county's comparables are. I went a little outside because technically there would have only been 4 comparables. Only one of those comparables is clerk recorder, registrar of voters, and clerk of the board. And And so I didn't think sending one, hey, look, this is the only comparable county in my size range. So I did more than that. And what I found was, yes, the clerk recorder across the board, if they're just clerk recorder, makes roughly $54 an hour. The clerk recorder, when they're, as an average across the counties that I looked at, clerk recorder, registrar of voters is typically average at $62 an hour. And when you add the clerk of the board in, it comes up to $68 an hour. And this isn't for me that I necessarily am asking for a raise, to be honest. It's just I want to make sure when we're talking about positions that I'm not saying that mine is less important than other positions, considering I do have several departments I look at. Apparently, I am very defensive about that my department is important. I want you to know we're important. Anyway, so I tried to look at comparable counties that were really like. The problem is you look at Tuolumne County and their clerk of the board and their county clerk auditor elections, and then we've got assessor recorder. So that's where we're saying it was hard to find comparables, because what are they actually? And then I noticed whenever there was just clerk recorder, that is what would have brought the average down from either of those studies to a lower rate. Because they are getting paid roughly in the $40 an hour range. But what's not taken into consideration is in those same counties, they have a registrar of voters who's a department head who also makes $90,000 a year. And they have a clerk to the board who's a department head who also makes $90,000 a year. So it's really hard to look at comparables when it's like, well, technically those three department heads make 3 times as much as I do. So they shouldn't be in the comparison because it's a completely different comparison and they're doing completely different tasks than I am. Anyways, again, I just thought that when we're looking at comparisons, it really should be taken into consideration what the actual tasks of that job are. And in mine, I'm the county clerk, I'm the county recorder, I'm the county clerk of the board, although you always see Diane and she's doing most of it. I do the background side of it that nobody sees, though. And there's also the registrar of voters, which obviously takes up a lot of my time. And I keep hearing through the grapevine that clerk recorders want rid of registrar of voters. I have no intent on trying to get rid of part of my job. But it's just not as easy as maybe it was at one point. There's always changing legislation, and we have to be on top of it. And maybe my position doesn't require education, but I do want to put out there, anytime educational opportunities are available that benefit the county, I take those educational opportunities. I spend my own money. I go to college courses, whether it's taking a Spanish class because we need bilingual election workers, or I have my municipal clerk's degree because that's what city clerks should have to be able to do their jobs appropriately. And those aren't just courses that are offered by my association, which I also take. Those are actual college courses / certificates that are out there that it's like, this is the best thing for if you are a municipal clerk, which a big role of my job is being a municipal clerk. So no, there's not required education, mainly because the position is so diverse. The best way to get educated in your job is experience. And lucky for me, I had the opportunity to be in each one of those departments prior to being the management for that department. So yes, on paper, I've been here 12 years. However, I was here 3 years before that working when extra hire could still work full-time, working full-time extra hire. So more than anything, this was for me to make my 2 cents of please don't say that my department is less valued than the other departments.
Tim, I got a thought here. If the auditor already built a 21% into hers, and the assessor built a 31% into hers, then we're really only talking about somewhere around 10%. I mean, there's enough of a buffer in there that if we had to make an adjustment down the road, is there, do we have to revise our ordinances or anything to make this work? Because I remember we were tied, they're tied to the Board of Supervisors.
Yes.
It's almost like we're all together.
There would be that piece that does need to be addressed. So there are two options. Obviously, one, the board could choose to revise that ordinance to not have those positions reflected or as part of a salary calculation, or the board could simply say that they're not going to take the adjustment, which I know prior boards have done just that. It creates some challenges down the road for then an oncoming board person, and then what the salary, on paper should be based on ordinance. The cleaner option is to do something with the board's ordinance. If the board doesn't want to be tied to those positions, then we do need to change what the salary for the board compensation needs to be looked at.
My point is there enough money built into this as a buffer right now that we don't really need to be looking that closely at the number? We can schedule an agenda item on these 4 elected positions as a separate agenda item, have a separate discussion on what kind of numbers we want to accept or what numbers are workable.
Well, that was the original discussion we had, and I think knowing that we continue, as you can see, the passion coming here and
I appreciate
the challenges and disagreements on interpretations over what is or isn't, and not trying to put HR or my office in a position of making quote unquote value judgments, which isn't intended to be. I think for us it was, does the board want to see this still come back? Here's kind of the range that we're at. And I would also say, keeping in mind, just because a position's 30% out doesn't mean that we can necessarily fix that entire hole. I mean, the prime example are deputy sheriffs. They were 30% out. We did really the best we could at the 15% with the 2 7.5% increases. So it might have to be a phased approach as well.
Can I clarify and speak on HR's behalf? So when we did the salary surveys, and I think there's some misconception on how HR made these recommendations. So the numbers that you see up here doesn't mean that that's all the percentage that they were out. This was the recommendation that we made on what we should, the increase that we should be making at this time. And so when we did stick to those counties that were the comparisons that we used for SEIU, so that it would be the same parameters that we did with the unions, because these departments, these electeds, their employees are SEIU represented employees. And so with those parameters, we averaged, we also took out the items that, or the counties that they were way out, that it did not make sense to compare those counties. And then we also took all of our positions, all of our appointed department heads and mid-managers, and looked at those salaries and where these positions fit into those classifications and where the increases would make sense. And I agree wholeheartedly that these elected officials, their salaries are not equitable, that they do need to be adjusted. But the recommendations that we made doesn't mean that they're only out there by 13%. It's where we felt they fit and where it would be a amount that we could be successful in getting them increases. And that's where we were hoping to be successful in getting them this step, and then down the road trying to move forward. Shirley Ryan and I, CAO Ryan and I, tried to bring appointed and electeds to the board prior to her leaving, and were not successful. And so CAO Lutz and I were trying to do the same thing. We were trying to come up with percentages that we could be successful in getting them increases. And so this does not mean that this was the total of the inequity. This is what we felt we could be successful in getting them increases.
And Judy, I remember sitting through the budget hearings of 2016, and this was a topic that was brought up then. This is not a new topic, But it's just a matter of, it's that one little piece of unfinished business that we still need to deal with. And if it requires being a separate agenda item, so be it.
Yes, and HR is, I want to make that understood that we are fully behind. We feel that they do need these equity increases, but the numbers that we suggested does not mean that that's all the comparison showed.
Supervisor Garamendi, lights on.
I'm sorry.
I would be very interested in knowing the total cost of both columns. You gave me what the increase is, but the total cost overall, of what it's going to cost with these increases going forward with all the tabulations of pensions and everything.
Right.
This is your fully burdened cost. This would be option one, fully burdened, again, what the increase is, and option two, fully burdened with the increase.
So that's full burden, everything that we would have to pay out for compensation, benefits.
And that also includes the 2% increase January 5th.
Supervisor Clapp, your light's on. You have a
Yeah,
question,
we
comment?
had this conversation with Manuel Lopez before, and he recommended that we need to do something about hooking everybody's wages to some way where it's not in front of us all the time. And I think Supervisor Garamendi asked for us to do something with the supervisor's wages when we had that vote, where to come back, where it was taken out of our hands. Yeah, so I agreed with you at that time too. And here it is in front of us again, we're doing the same, the same runaround. I mean, we have our friends in front of us wanting a raise, our neighbors, and, so we know these people, and they're coming in front of us and have to ask this way. And I just think that there has to be a better way, instead of trying to rewrite the whole thing with the supervisors and everything else. I know some people, they come here, and this is their job, they're making their living at, is most people can't sit on this board. And it's just, it is a problem. It's been brought to our attention before, and we've done nothing about it. That was, 5 months ago when that came up, and we're still in the same place. And I would like to have something done with that, where we'd have some way of setting what these should be, instead of everyone having to come like it is now in front of the board. And we need to do something. Manuel gave us a couple of suggestions how to do it, and we need to look at that. I mean, we need to get some type of thing where this doesn't keep on going on. That's what my position is, and I do agree. I think they're underpaid, and I understand the problems that makes with that. When you got management coming up underneath you, they're stuck. Like myself, is the position that I have right here is, in the real world, it wouldn't work. I mean, I take huge amounts of my salary just to pay for an aide to help me with this stuff. That makes me where I'm more able to, respond to my people in my district. And so there's just things that has to be changed. And I think we need to have that conversation with everything. That's where I'm at.
Supervisor Mills?
And one of those conversations, it was brought up tying it to the judicial system. I remember him talking about that. But there are multiple methods, and I think he'd mentioned 4 of them, if we go back on the tape and look at them, that take that responsibility for the elected, including ourselves, out of the equation of making that decision. So I would like to see us look in that direction.
Supervisor Oliveri, you have anything to say?
I'll try to be short and brief. 21% raise, 32% raise. If adjustments needed, not all at one time. You're absolutely right, ladies. You are in an elected position. You knew this coming in. We're in an elected position. We work for the people. there is no way I will support a 31% raise, even a 21% raise for these 4 department heads that are elected officials. Nothing personal. It's the duty of my constituents.
Supervisor Garamendi, where are you on? No. So we have 2 that are in favor of moving forward with this, and we have 2 that are against.
Do you like being the chair?
Or
Do you like being the chair?
No, that's fine. As far as the comments about moving this forward, so we're not in this position to have this or do this, I'm not really in favor of that. I think this is part of our job. It's always been part of our job. It would be, saying that we don't want to deal with any of the negotiations or increases for the employees. We're all employees of the county in all of our positions, whether we're elected or not. And this board has been elected, our positions, to deal with this. This is what we have as part of our agenda. And I understand the inequities that are being presented here as far as what other counties are doing with compensation for these positions and the former positions that came just before us that we agreed to move forward with. Somewhat, it depends on if they're on the books now or not. Apparently, these are in the same situations where some departments have already included it in their budgets. And I was going through some of the budgets as we were sitting here, and it's very interesting how from July 1st to September 1st, there's been a substantial increase on income on some of these versus the expenses, and I'm not sure what's going on with that to get to the 5% or what, but there's some substantial increases in revenues that I saw in some of these departments that we're talking about here. I certainly understand Supervisor Oliveira's statement on increase this size all at once. I think when we went back and gave increases to some of the other employees in the county, we did step increases. We did going forward and then in January. So we did some steps, and some of them weren't even this as much as what you guys are asking for here. So is that equitable to the other employees? Again, since we're all employees of the county, all of us here are. How do you respond to other electeds? I see a couple other electeds, or at least one elected in here right now. Actually 2 elected in here that aren't on this list. And their pitch, if this goes forward on the inequities in their salary ranges. I would say this, giving the left-hand column, I would be in favor of doing some type of step increases, and not all at once, possibly going forward from September 25th, this is coming back to us. A 6% increase, and then coming forward next year, and maybe at midterm we can discuss going forward with an additional increase from there. I understand having to move along and get up to the standards of other counties surrounding us and attracting people to run for these positions, and trying to entice people that have the expertise to do the jobs that these departments are doing, and all departments as far as that goes in the county here. So I would be in favor of that. If we can convince 2 other board members of something like that, I think you would have that, and we can move forward going that way. it at least establishes some way of being able to give you some way of moving forward towards the goal of bringing full equity, and it would still maintain what we've done with other employees in the county with their increases. So
what exactly is your proposal here?
I would take the left-hand column, the county's salary survey, and I would, since we have a 21, 13, 11, and 11, I would say cut them all in half and do a step increase starting September 25th of half those moving forward, and then come January at midterm, when the other increases from the other employees that we gave increases to comes forward, to look at going forward from that time, the other half of the increases on the left-hand side of the county survey, to get some equity in we're not continuously in some of these positions as we were in non-department heads and employees, some equity to these departments and with other counties. I can't make the motion right now. I need somebody, but that's my proposal that I'm putting forward. It's something that I feel and I've thought about in looking at and going through some of the budget here that I could go with. So that's what I'm saying my proposal is. If you guys don't agree to it, you don't. We're stuck 2-2, and you would support that, Supervisor Mills? So Supervisor Oliveira?
I have a question before I declare. What did our bargaining unit settle for raise in these departments? Maybe Ms. Hawkins can answer that. She's probably the best authority on that.
Overall, SEIU is getting 4%.
4%?
Now, can you clarify, there's a
It's
difference
split too.
between COLAs and equity increases? Because this would
Correct.
be more in line with what we did for specific equity increases.
And so our equities for SEIU, they just got 5%.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chair, I would entertain at 5% at this time as a starting point and going from there.
Supervisor Garamendi?
And I'm just going to point out the obvious, guys. We're supposed to be sitting here cutting our budget. We're going to be arguably talking about positions existing or not existing in this next year. I'm sympathetic. I get it. But at the same time, I'm going to try not to get into cattiness on this thing. But, you know, I've had, you guys have brought up the stuff. I'll just leave it there.
Okay.
No.
Here, no. So we have 2 on the proposal I put forward, so we have 3 votes to do that going forward. Okay.
Thank you.
That's the direction of the board. Okay?
And then if I could have one more piece of feedback on that for the, because I know council will be asking too, on the board's ordinance, do you want us to, at this point, that's going to take longer than the 25th, but do you want us to continue to look at bringing something back for an adjustment on how we tie salary on the board? I know that's another issue that comes up a lot.
Well, in my opinion, historically, and I've gone through this before, is the board can either accept a raise or not accept a raise. So, and historically, we haven't accepted raises.
So just let this point, let it ride.
Let it stay.
Okay. So then really that just brings me to the best slide, the undone slide, which is acknowledgements. And again, I want to thank the board for the, again, the consistent support. I think signaling the direction for the departments and setting that course, I think that was tremendously helpful and really set the tone for going into these last few months. Also want to again thank Becca, who's over talking to Judy, auditor controller staff, but certainly Rebecca, because of the countless tireless hard hours of work to get this budget document together. It definitely was a labor of love for us all, and it would not have been possible without her. Same with information technology and Barbara Biddick. She, again, I think she feels like she can have her life back for a little bit with just how many extra hours she was putting in for this project. I want to thank my office staff again. Just tremendous. I couldn't do what I do without all of them, so thank you. Human resources, risk management, again, that same thing. There's a lot of behind-the-scenes work and meetings and effort that goes into getting a budget together, so I appreciate that. And last but definitely not least is our departments. Our department heads were excellent to work with through this cycle. I really appreciate the cooperation, the effort, and also the fiscal staff, so thank you.
I have one item. Jack and I had met with a group of people recently that would like to move forward with the San Andreas Historical District and designate some area, downtown area, as a historical district and register it with the state so they can be eligible for some grant funds that come forward.
Yes.
CDBG. And at that time we were discussing the needed funds to do what is needed as far as documentation, and then the cost to submit it to the state for their approval. And the cost, we were trying to be very conservative in the cost, but we figured it would be about $15,000. And we wanted to ask the board if they were interested in that going forward. If we would fit the funds. We talked about, of course, we have you put it where you felt it would be necessary, but we talked about Patrick Martin's budget.
It would be most appropriate because they are county buildings to be in this budget.
Most all of these are county buildings, and so not all of them, but most of them in the historic downtown are. So I would like to pull the board going forward. Supervisor Clapp?
Have you talked to the landowners that it's not county property? Because I know there is conditions. You go to historic, you can't change outside the building. There's a lot of stuff with those. So
We were in the process of doing that, but most of them, again, are county-owned buildings. There are some that aren't, and I think Mr. Foley owns some of it.
He does.
But we wanted to see if we had, in order to go forward, we want to see if we had the support of the board to go forward on it before we move forward.
I would be for it if the landowners are for it. I would support that.
All right. Supervisor Mills?
Yeah, I think we have to explore whether or not everyone is generally going to be in there. We don't want to tie somebody's hands or make it difficult for them in the future. So to explore it and then bring back to the board what we might consider the best options.
Okay. Supervisor Olivera?
I would agree with looking into it, but no budget item at this time other than to get more information.
So, that's what I was going to say, because it will matter on whether I bring a line item back in for the 15,000 at this point. We can look at it. Okay.
Okay. Do we have enough time on final budget approval to authorize that line item? That's the issue.
They would have to come back after
Have to
approval,
come
and we
back.
can
Have
do
to
that.
come back?
We do it. Take it
All
as
right,
it is.
I would be for it, but seeing we get it addressed.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. I mean, I think we ought to look at it. This is a great test case for a lot of other areas in our county. We own some of the key buildings there. They have some of the most complete archives in the state of California, buildings that are falling down. Our museum is important for tourism, and if San Andreas is standing up strong, it benefits the entire county. So, yes, wholeheartedly.
Yeah. And to point out, we are struggling with some of the buildings that we own there and keeping them maintained. And this would open an area for us to at least get some CDBG grants, money to maintain those buildings. There's a lot of history in Calaveras on the main street in San Andreas here. So, okay. Other than that, any other board comments, deliberation before I open up the public comment?
Do we want to take a break, or do
Yeah.
we want to keep going? I guess that would be the other
Well,
question.
I thought we would take a minute.
There's one more item for the board in terms of just technical adjustments, and I had sent you the email earlier about moving, because right now, if you look at your Schedule 9s in your budget, there is a line item for appropriations for contingencies.
Oh.
So what we want to do is, in talking with Tim, his concern is that if a department ended up not receiving all of the revenue that they ended up needing in their operating budget, and their special revenue fund is holding some funds that they could use, all of that unused fund balance at this point is locked up in appropriations for contingency. And in order to unlock that, we'd have to come back to the Board of Supervisors in order to have you bless unlocking that. So my suggestion was, for any of those circumstances where we see a current utilization, is to actually take 10% of what's currently budgeted in that line item for appropriations for contingencies and actually move that to an expenditure line item, and then take the remaining balance and actually move it just to obligated fund balance. That way we are in compliance with GASB 54, which means that you as the board are blessing the obligation of fund balance. Many of these fund balances and these special revenue funds are restricted for use. You can, I kind of always tell people, you can only use it on crunchy peanut butter on Tuesdays. You can't use it for anything else. And that's a lot of what our special revenue funds are. They can only be used for very specific programs under very specific conditions. And it's the fund balance itself, and Tim had mentioned this kind of earlier in the budget discussion, is we kind of forget to budget the fund balance. And so this is the mechanism to do that. So in order to give departments a little bit of breathing room, make those additional technical adjustments to bring back on the 25th for your adoption. Doesn't change the total size of the budget. It doesn't change the, if you look at many of the schedules that are in there, it doesn't change anything other than we're just going to move it from one column to the other. And so I did send him my recommendation. He can go through, and if he wants to kind of shift anything around, but that would be my one other recommendation to the board.
Does everybody understand what she's talking about?
If any of that made sense.
So Supervisor Clapp, are you in favor?
Yes.
Mills?
Yes.
Yeah, yes.
Supervisor Olivera?
No, I'd like to have board control over that expenditure as we do right now.
No, you would. So what we would do, we would actually move it to an obligated reserve. And so in order for them to get it out of that reserve, it would have to come to the board. But what we're saying is we're going to take 10% of that in order to allow the department to have basically a 10%
Overrun.
buffer.
Contingency.
Buffer?
Yeah.
And if I can add something as you're deliberating on this piece, because this has been a debate within my office and the Auditor Controller's office. Coming from a department like Health and Human Services with complex funding sources, you do try and do your best, but there's also instances where you want to build in a cushion, and sometimes the fact that having to take something to the board delays you out 3 to 5 weeks. It delays response if it's about trying to get a payment on an appropriation line, or if we're at year end and we're running into a problem about being able to pay a vendor. I don't think this is a common issue, but I do think from the perspective of trying to provide some level of speed, and that's where, we talked about, is 10% reasonable, maybe it's 5%, but something that is at least a little bit of that buffer where we don't run into a problem where suddenly the auditor's telling them, hey, you guys are out of an appropriation, you can't pay bills until we go to the board, and it happens to be on one of those days where there's not a board meeting for 2 weeks and they have to get it out.
Is that written up in this document that we're looking at, this
So,
request?
so currently, the document, if you go to the budget schedules tab, there is, I think it's on Schedule 2. I think it's Schedule 2. There is a column for increase to obligated fund balance. And so my recommendation is, in coordination with the CAO, that we reduce that obligated fund balance column by, in some cases, by 10%, and move that over to funding uses.
So, but what you're suggesting is not in there. The schedule exists, but you're suggesting a change to the schedule,
Yeah,
correct?
we're suggesting
And
basically a shift.
And that's a policy decision that we're making? So maybe what we ought to do, and excuse my caution, but usually at the last minute of a budget, if I hear something and I'm only hearing it verbally,
Right.
I'd like to see it written and see exactly what that is, because it may be nothing, it may be something, but
And if I
to
could add,
tack on
part
at
of
the end.
the lateness of this is us working through the mechanics of this new process. And I'll give you an example. You know, we really push departments to follow the rules of putting that fund balance in contingencies. I would say most listen to that, with the exception of one department that played the old game, which is basically dump it all up in appropriations already, even though they're not going to spend it all. We're going to have to work with that department this next year and have a realistic picture of what that, of what their spend really is, because it also, you know, makes it look like we're going to be doing a lot more than we really are. So part of it is that we are kind of putting the wheels on this thing as it's going down the road to make it work and provide that flexibility. So I apologize that it wasn't something that we did bake out, because it's responding to concerns on how we're going to operate within this budget.
I think my concern is what's baked in and what's been baked out, since we're on bakery
Yeah,
terms
so
today.
all of
I
it
think I'd
is-
like to see it baked.
Okay, so
That's
all,
right.
yeah, all of it is in the budget. There's not a dollar that is not in that budget. It's just reclassifying it to this pot as opposed to this pot as opposed to this pot.
And I'm just curious to see exactly what these pots are.
Okay. And I have that. I sent it to Tim, so I can make that available to the rest of the board. But that would be our one change to include with the adoption on the 25th. And that way, the other benefit of having, when you look at that column on, it is Schedule 2, I believe.
It's page 134.
Okay. And there's a whole list of obligation increases to fund balance. Part of the benefit of that is when when we're doing a capital lease, or if we're getting rated by a bond agency or anything like that, they want to see our budget and they want to see our CAFR. And so having those obligated fund balances basically sitting there as reserves tells a bond rating agency and tells external parties that we don't spend every dime. We keep a certain level of reserves even in our special revenue funds, and that to a degree is healthy. But what it also helps me is with cash flow. And so if we had to do any sort of internal borrowing or anything, I have a clear list of what is not expected to be appropriated, expended in this fiscal year. So that's the other benefit of having that there.
My bad, Rebecca, it's 128, but the point still is that having that increased obligated fund balance, it doesn't put us into that pickle like we had with Phillips to Jordan.
You can basically say, here's money here, but in order to get it out of that column, we would have to come back to the board to say, here's what we need the money for, here is where we would like to pull it from, and then we would have to do a board action in order to pull it out of there and appropriate it.
And it would take a 4/5 vote.
It would take a 4/5 vote. Whether we pull it out of appropriations for contingency or you pull it out of a reserve for obligated fund balance, it does require a 4/5 vote.
One quick note, who would administer all this activity? Through your office?
Who administers all of the
Yeah,
activity?
who would be doing this transfers of funds? And that would be your office, right?
Upon direction of the board.
I understand.
Yes.
And there would be, would there be any 87 costs or anything involved with it?
We do, yeah, all of that is included in our internal cost allocation plan. So the administrative office, they do size of budget. I do number of transactions. So county council does, they do time study by department that they're doing.
So it's
work
actually
for.
creating more work for you and for the CAO.
We have to do it anyway.
And to some extent, this basically just, it's a identical process to how we do it with general fund contingency now. So if a department has an issue, they're typically working with either the auditor's office or my office. We identify what it is, what's needed, do the budget transfer, and then it comes to the board and it just notes it's pulling from contingency. It requires the 4/5 vote.
Our basis is, are we looking at added expenses for this?
No, and just to kind of catch you up, this is the first budget book that you guys have ever received with these schedules in them.
Okay.
You normally don't, and unfortunately, that puts me in a pickle, because what has happened historically is the emphasis has been on revenues, transfers in, expenditures, and transfers out, and there is a like fund balance is somewhere. And when I have to put the budget together in order to submit it to the state controller in their format, it has to be a balanced budget. So I have the starting fund balance as of June 30th. I have the revenues and the transfers in. I have the expenses and the transfers out. And then I have this number that's just sitting there that you didn't appropriate, you didn't bless, you didn't agree to obligate it. You really don't know potentially that it's even there. And that is not that's not the intent of the Budget Act. And the intent of the Budget Act specifically says you're supposed to bless that. You're supposed to say, we are going to obligate this fund balance, or we're going to appropriate it for contingency, or we're going to do something with it. And historically, that hasn't happened because the fund balance is an afterthought. And then I'm having to kind of shoulder that responsibility, which makes me extremely uncomfortable because that's not really my authority. So what we did with the budget software is we said, you know what, this is a perfect opportunity to get this out in the forefront, put it in front of the board. But again, we're trying to put the wheels on the bus while it's driving down the road. And, you know, we're going, well, in hindsight, we should have done this a little bit different or coded that a little bit different, and our chart of accounts should have taken this into consideration. So I apologize that this is kind of coming in bits and pieces and at the end of the presentation, but this is the first time, as far as I have ever been here, where fund balance is actually part of the budget discussion, and that you are having it in front of you in a schedule where you can see, here is the fund balance that we're expecting to go into next fiscal year on those special revenue funds.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? And so I'll get that list to you of those changes though.
Yeah, I kind of feel a little bit like Jack. I'd like to get the bus to a pit stop or a gas station, have all the wheels put back on, and then come and present it to us as a whole, and so we can look at it and make a judgment on what you're asking, whether 10% or say no 10%, put it all in contingencies, and when departments go over, they need to call on their contingency, bring it to the board so we're aware of it, and we can make a decision one way or another on whether to expend those monies or.
It would make a natural round 2 or chapter 2 to the financial policy that was adopted recommended to include designated funds and the handling of fund balance and contingency.
And I understand your compromise, you're under 10%.
Yeah, I don't really care.
So, or your recommendation, not your compromise, but your recommendation. So, but is it possible to bring this back when everything's worked out, or?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
We could do that at that point. I mean, again, just knowing that there will be some limitation on a few things having to come back more frequently to the board. We hopefully should be okay based on how they budgeted realistically, but it could come back as.
But you're talking about bringing these,
We're early in the budget, so it's not gonna affect us now. As we get further on,
It would mostly be year end.
year end or mid-year or sometime when things are looking a little bit sideways.
so because we're trying to figure out what we're putting forward in the final document. So is your recommendation to leave it the way that it is,
It
which
is.
is
It's
just
exactly how it's
appropriations for contingencies, and it is what it is, and then work towards making a transition to something different?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay? That's my, guys agree?
That would be with a policy to back it up.
Yes.
I would agree.
Agreed.
All right,
Well, that's less work, so, good.
all right.
Okay.
So, is that it?
That was it on my presentation, unless the board had specific questions for me or other direction.
I think we should open it up for public comment.
Mr. Chair?
Yeah, sure. We can take a break, Madam Clerk.
Hold that thought, Al.
All right, we're back from break. We'll open up the public comment.
I look first. Al Segala, Taxpayer Association. Thank you for the good work. Wow, this is really hard. How many public officials, elected public officials, ran for office because of the bucks, because you need the money? I don't think any of you did. And I don't think any of our other elected officers did either. If I ran for dog catcher and the salary was $100,000, and I told the people, elect me, once I get in there, I'm going to raise my salary 30%. You think I would get elected? No. But once I'm in there, they can't kick me out because I want to increase my salary. A different story. Elected officials don't punch a time card. They don't punch a time card. Their salaries should be there. It's annual salaries. They're different than the other employees that are working by the hour. By comparing them to the other employees, you start to evaluate them not on their abilities or their leadership. You start to evaluate them on the same thing you would evaluate the other employees. Do they show up on time? Do they do their work? You know, that sort of thing. So, the recommendation of Gary was very good. And also, Clyde had a good point about getting a consultant involved that's familiar with this kind of a problem, but not involved with us, like Manuel Lopez. That's a good idea. Also, you're representing the taxpayers, and I see you're really trying to do a good job doing that. And so an elected official is not the same as a department head. We're getting confused with that a little bit. And it's understandable because the work is similar. But the elected official is elected by the public and the taxpayer. The employee is hired by the county. It's a little different. I told you it'd be short. It's short. Thank you.
All right, other public comments?
It's an interesting way of cutting 5% off the budget. It doesn't ring true for me. I think about the Butte fire victims, and I think about everyone else that owns property, and their property values have gone up as a result of people buying property to grow pot on. And they paid a high price for that. And so now the people that either buy that property or the other people that are Butte fire victims not only had their land assessed at a lot more, but now if they try to replace their house, they're not going to be protected by Proposition 13 if they build the same size house. That's my understanding. And so the budget has enough money that people think they can get more money for their salaries. And I think it's a bloodletting of the actual constituency of Calaveras County citizens. Thank you.
Vicki Reinke, Calaveras County. I did have some questions. Obviously, from sitting in the audience, being the taxpayer, when you see things like increases of 11%, 21%, 31%, it does make you say, whoa. I thought, I know we're not a wealthy county, so it makes you want to sit back and say, this needs to be looked at a little bit more. Should we pay our employees properly here in Calaveras County? Of course. But I think Calaveras is really unique as a county. From my perspective, it's a small county, it's a rural county. It's not a growing county. There's just a lot of those issues. So when looking at salaries for people who work here, elected officials, whatever, comparisons should be made as good comparisons. You may not be able to pay the same as someone down in the Bay Area. But anyway, so that question, and then the other question is, I don't know what their benefits are, but we have to always look at that as well, because those benefits after the retirement, those benefits then become a liability to the county, as we all know what PERS is doing to counties and cities. So that needs to be taken into consideration. Also, I wasn't sure if you guys were saying you shouldn't make the decision about their increases, or if it should be someone else that makes those decisions. But I say you represent the taxpayers of the county. We come to you to ask, for your guidance and understanding of what's going on. So anyway, I just want to make that comment because there's a lot of people in this county, and to make those kind of raises for everybody, we could be broke. And that's just what Calaveras County is. And so I hope that that's taken into consideration. And I also want to know, what was the result? What is the decision? Are you just all across the board going to give the raises to them, or were we doing some kind of a studies to look at all those salaries so the public can participate? These are public servants, and it is our taxpayers' money that pays for it, and I think we should have some kind of a say or an understanding. I'm glad today it was very apparent. It was right there in front of us that that's what was being asked for, but I think there needs to be an opportunity to have public input. So anyway, that's my question, is what was decided in the end?
Other public comments? Any other public comments?
Neil McEwen, Calaveras County resident. The politicizing of the budget has become a prime example of why the public does not trust certain members of this board. Implementing a strategy that uses disinformation to intentionally mislead uninformed, active segments of the electorate into counterfactual territory is at the root of this mistrust. In researching this topic, I came across a working paper from Frank Bond, Nimjin Center for Economics, Institute for Management Research, Radboud University, Netherlands, which studied the impact of misinformation on the political budget cycle. Quote, if all voters were fully informed about the economy, voters would be able to infer government competence before elections, irrespective of government actions. Benefiting from the assumed ignorance of part of the electorate, the incumbent has an incentive to appear as competent as possible. Uninformed voters can be fooled, thereby affecting the incumbent's re-election chances. The incumbent can improve his re-election chances because a share of the electorate is assumed to be susceptible to government manipulations. The government in power has two instruments for appearing more competent. It can increase deficit finance transfers before elections and cut transfers to repay the pre-election deficit after elections. And 2, it can reduce the deficit perception by spreading disinformation. Bond goes on to say, quote, "It seems plausible that a government which is willing to use fiscal policy for manipulating the whole economy would a fortiori also be willing to foster the dissemination of false or misleading information. Politicians will want to overestimate the benefits of government programs and underestimate the current and future taxes required to pay for those programs. Second, there is a specific inclination during election years to produce even more optimistic public finance forecasts. Dennis, Clyde, and Gary have chosen to eliminate $13 million in tax revenue from the county budget and utilize this model of disinformation to contradict the $9 million deficit predicted by the CAO. Political opportunism based on disseminating disinformation is why you have lost the public's trust. Continued miscalculations regarding how many people in this county you can deceive will be your downfall."
Well, I'd like to echo that sentiment. I find it very disturbing that we have a big deficit after last year's big cash carryover. Also, when speaking to female elected officials, I think it's really important that we use the right language. I mean, don't call us ladies. We're women, and we make 80.6 cents to your dollar. Women of color make even less. There is a gender pay gap. I think it's important that the women who are elected in this county and that serve in this county make the same as men. I think that it is extremely dishonest to have, well, I've attended the town hall at the Veterans, and neither Gary or Clyde knew the amount that Measure C had been collected that day. I had spoken with the tax office, and they told me 13 million. People doubted that. Then they said, I think it was you, Gary, that said that we don't have the figures for what the cannabis program cost, but it was astronomical, and it was way more than what we took in. And it's like, still haven't seen a nexus study. My understanding is that there are refunds pending. So I feel like there is a lot of misinformation that's being put out there, that when you want to appeal to your constituents that you feel brought you here, you say, oh, we're fiscally conservative, we're doing great budget-wise, we have all this extra money, not because of Measure C, but because there was more sales tax. Never mind that was a lot of cannabis money that was being spent building up our farms. Or we have a lot of sale. We have more. We have $500,000 here from extra property tax, and so look, we have an extra $1 million, and it's like, but that Measure C, that doesn't really matter. 68% of the voters said tax the cannabis growers. 3 of you decided that you knew better. You need to reinstate that money because we cannot afford to go without it. We cannot afford budget deficits, and priority-based budgeting is not appropriate. It's like I'm baffled at the amount of money that is being discussed to give raises, and I have no idea why all the cannabis hires are still employed.
Thank you.
They should be laid off.
Other public comments?
Sue Holbert, District 2. I do not grow marijuana. I do not use it, although I would if I come up with a medical condition that would indicate that. And it seems to me this budget is somehow so interwoven with that issue. It's not separate from it. one thing is it looked like there was something like $9 million extra, and then it was said that there was $9 million deficit, then $9 million extra, and now it's looking like it's $9 million extra. I don't know how that is calculated. I do not know the intricacies of bookkeeping and accounting and that kind of stuff. But it seems to me that it was stated that there was $5 million extra, and that won't be coming in. That's not expected to be coming in since the ban, but still, there's money that's it looks like the economic trajectory is painted as if it's going straight up, straight up, straight up from where it was. And what I hear from people who are running businesses in this county is they are hurting. I heard somebody who was making 10% of what she made last year and is worried about closing down. She's not the only one that are hurting. So where you're going to get the taxes from businesses in this county, I don't know. When the economics of this county became 19% were based on the influx of marijuana. I know there was a lot of problems involved with that, but I don't see how suddenly taking that away is going to leave you with an increasing trajectory of money coming in. I don't get it. And I also saw that the code compliance is supposed to be now based on not getting rid of any of those people who are hired to do that, but on the people in that department raising their own salaries. And then I heard that, okay, this has been postponed, that will be decided next year sometime, but that amount is still in the budget, as if it had already been decided. What are you guys doing? It's not clear to me.
Good afternoon. I agree this budget is highly politicized. Not surprising, it's election time, and particularly the D5 seat looks to me to be riding on being able to sell voters on the idea that county finances are just fine, especially in relationship to the ban. Three of you keep telling us how great the budget is thanks to your fiscally conservative practices, and some of you like to claim the county lost a lot of money on registration fees. I have video recordings of this numerous occasions. Despite various departments' documented best efforts to spend down those registration fees, even when they had to stretch the rules to the breaking point to do so, there's still what looks like the better part of $1 million left over that may have to be refunded. And I want to just point out on that note that at a campaign forum earlier, Supervisor Clapp said this was a huge expense on the county, that we really was losing money, and on the $5,000 permits we were charging, we were losing money. We didn't make money on the $5,000, we lost money on that. Well, by the way, you're not supposed to be a for-profit enterprise. Never mind that. He also said the county is doing well. It has a financial budget. We carry over $9 million into the previous year, and we're doing well. This is the first time since '07 that we didn't use teeter funds to balance the budget. I'll come back to that. An ABC 10 news story last Friday referenced statements made by Supervisor Mills, quote, "When asked to provide for his preferred solution to the increased budget deficit, Mills ventured into counterfactual territory, saying via email that the idea the county has a growing deficit is not corroborated by our financial condition," end quote. News 10, but it does have a growing deficit. County officials reported the budget deficit for the coming year is expected to be $9 million, almost exactly the amount of cannabis taxes paid by licensed growers last year, and also a fourfold increase over the last year's $2.3 million deficit. At the June budget hearings, we heard there was a $9.26 million structural deficit. today presented CAO's budget message says the budget is structurally balanced. And as Sue pointed out, today in the budget that I'm looking at, the code enforcement is still relying on the new 8.06 rules, which has been tabled till next year. And that hasn't been factored into the budget. And I didn't see where the several $100,000 in returned registration fees was factored into the budget. And this is a rear view mirror projection going forward, and that don't work.
Any other public comments? Any other public comments? Seeing none, I will close public comments, bring it back to the board. Is there any other board comments?
Well, for the sake of time, just to kind of remind the board that on the budget for this year, on the 615 positions that we have in the allocation, and this is approved underfill, I counted up 106 are vacant at the start of the year. That would leave us with, that was vacant and some underfills are in there as well. Last year, our vacant positions, just in general fund only, gave back $2.8 million into the budget, or into the contingencies. So that's not a method of developing reserves. I think that if we're going to consistently have vacant positions, we have to be looking at those departments that are carrying that vacancy load for the HR people. And that I said before that there needs to be some way of putting the HR costs into that department's budget where they're using an exorbitant amount of time. I think there's some A87 costs that are also at stake in that. And so it's just one of those areas that I'd like to see worked on as to how do we stop this 18% vacancy rate that we have right now. If you were in a hotel or motel, that wouldn't work. But this would just be a good example.
It's back for the board discussion.
Is this okay?
Yeah.
Like doing public comment on the meeting, right? Or on the budget.
We just had public comment on the budget. This is the board discussion.
I'd like to know from the CAO how we're going to deal with schedule, this is on schedule on page 252. Are we going to obligate that? Because right now it's showing just as a
Yes.
appropriation for contingency.
That it is showing the appropriation for contingency for the request, and we will be making a budget adjustment to move that. And for everyone's edification, since everybody might not have the huge document, we're talking about Fund 5600, which is the Cannabis Registration Fund. Right now, the fund balance for those
252.
fees are
252.
sitting, it's on page 252 of the budget book.
It's not?
Strange. We can get that corrected.
Wow.
Here. Sorry, apologize. So we have the budgeted $940,000 per the earlier discussion we had. It sitting on the contingencies line for the board's approval. We are instead going to make an adjustment to be moving that up to basically the refunds line on the budget, and that will be coming back in on the 25th for
Okay.
request for
I
approval.
just want to confirm that we are going to put it somewhere besides just in a contingency. On page 288, actually 287, we're talking about an admin analyst for the building department. I'm concerned that public official, like the building department, the head of these various departments should have a fairly good working knowledge of budgets and an understanding of their budgets and how budgets work. It should be almost at times a daily routine. And so I not sure whether or not I'd get support to, this is 288, actually it's page 287.
287 shows a chart.
Yeah, it's a chart.
It's a chart. To be clear, this was a position that was added by the board in preliminary, so it is one that has been added and they've been recruiting for. I guess from a broader discussion, the goal there was to provide somebody who, beyond the what the building official's doing, to provide more stronger fiscal support. The ultimate vision of it is to actually have that position cross-shared, doing some work in the planning department, doing some work potentially in environmental management, but all centered around budget and administration.
And I know we had discussed that before in a previous meeting when we made that decision. I just am concerned that maybe a Budget 101 session might be in order for department heads who do not have a functional understanding, daily understanding of how budgets operate and where they fit within that scheme.
I think there needs to be a lot of that training, yes.
Okay, it's the only purpose of the conversation. Are we okay on page 303 with the recommended CIP? And I'm looking at the auditor here. On page 303, this is talking about the CIPs. Do we have each one of those funding sources as being correct?
The only question that I have is, and I had left messages with your office in terms of the use of the COP funds for some of the stuff that is in CIP and in facilities. If we should evaluate the original statement, because when we did the refinancing on the certificates of participation, we did not change the list of allowable uses under the original statement. So making sure that those conform to that original statement, which was the reason we issued the debt to begin with. And if they're not, to swap funding out, whether it comes from teeter, and that could be another adjustment to bring back before the Board of Supervisors, but that would be one of my main concerns, is just making sure that the certificates of participation line up with the intent of the projects that they're covering.
And I don't want us to get sideways with the COP. That was the whole purpose of the question, is to be sure that each one of these funding sources does align with what is needed. And if it's not, then we need to make an adjustment, hopefully before we come back to final.
And
if we can do that.
That's certainly been something that we've looked at closely. And perhaps another meeting would be necessary. I know that there's been a lot of discussion both with my office and digging through the actual filings of the document and the bond or the debt instrument, where we're confident that this falls within that range on everything that was laid out. And bottom line is, yeah, you could swap out one thing and put it somewhere else because teeter's flexible. Ultimately, there's enough projects there to be utilized in the COP, but we're also pretty confident that we've captured what was encapsulated in the original document.
I just wanted on record that we be sure that we're not spending any money out of COP that's going to create a problem for us.
Yeah, and the only other, and this goes back to the discussion that we had at the department head on Monday with regards to projects that are going to be managed by IT, is that I don't know that the dollar amounts that were included in CIP encompass the additional staffing costs for his office, or if he's planning on contracting out for, outside consulting work. But I noticed we had that issue in this last budget where he absorbed work associated with capital projects, and that is going to hit him on the next indirect cost plan, and he wasn't counting on that. So that would be my only other.
It may or may not hit him depending on if we are able to get to an ISF structure, because then it would be project-based anyway.
Well, I'm putting the plan together for 1920 based on 17-18's costs. That would be the issue.
So allow me to move on then to the IT department, where IT has defined life cycles. And if we develop a project that's 5 years in length, but the life cycle of the actual item is only 2 years, we're running into a problem there. And I would like to see IT expensed by the department, costs recovered, so that the department itself has some method of paying for the costs. I'm thinking of the sheriff's department. There's many other departments where they are doing specific work. And this is, again, and I'm looking at Judy, is A87 losses because we're not expensing correctly. So I want that to be understood. The reoccurring fixed costs, there's A87s involved, and these life cycles might be too long or longer than what is reality. And the result is that we end up with a loss.
Yes, and that's been one of the discussions that I've had with Bonnie Rich and administration as well, is to look at the CIP projects and make sure that they should in fact be in CIP, or it may be that we need to make them smaller and more specific in scope so that we can get those respective projects done quicker, so that we're making sure that we're taking care of those. Basically, you don't want to buy a bunch of hardware and have a project going on for 5 or 6 years, because by the time I get to depreciate it, we already tossing it.
I just want it in the conversation.
Yeah.
Again, the last thing I have is on page 651 and 661 in the sheriff's budget. We have two line items for cannabis enforcement, the other one for cannabis regulatory. And we've got some money expended here. I want to be sure, 651 and 661, be sure that we have someone within the DA's department, in other words, we're staffing properly, that if they bring forward cases, that we have a way of prosecuting, and that we're not allowing cases to fall through the cracks simply because we don't have the staffing levels necessary to carry it
Recalling
out.
that the board did at.
The financial accountant.
And a attorney.
Embedded in the.
That is specifically dedicated to cannabis.
Yeah, I just want to be sure that they are properly staffed to handle the workload that may come as a result of what marijuana enforcement is doing. So that's all I have. I mean, I've got some other things on here, but I think those are the key points that I have concerns about.
Any other board comments? Seeing none, we'll move on to the next item on the agenda. Board announcements.
We're done?
Yeah.
Wow, okay.
Easier than you thought, right?
Board announcements.
Supervisor announcements. In compliance with AB 1234, Chapter is Government Code Section 53232.3D, board members shall provide brief reports on meetings they attended at the expense of the local agency at the next regular meeting of the legislative body. This report is required to include meetings attended for which there has been expense reimbursements, mileage, meals, lodging, etc., but may also, at the board member's discretion, include any other meeting attended by the supervisor on behalf of the county.
We'll start with Supervisor Clapp.
Yeah, I attended Good Morning Calaveras, and I attended the State of the County, and the chair and vice chair was there, and they spoke. And I attended CSA 1, and Public Works had 2 people there to help us out, and I guess they're going to be hitting all the CSA 1s in all our districts and explaining how to present something to the board for getting funds and stuff for getting projects done. So that should be going to all the boards, and it was very helpful, and I thank Mac for him doing it. It was the first time that the board actually had any contact with the county at that point at a board, where before they came down. Yeah, it was excellent.
Supervisor Mills.
And I also attended Good Morning Calaveras in State of the County, and also had a conversation CSA 2 had with Public Works, and a very positive outcome. And then I also spoke before the Poker Flat Homeowners Association last Saturday, and answered some of their concerns as well.
Supervisor Oliveira.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On September 5th, I attended the Ebbets Pass Property Owners Committee meeting. This is a monthly meeting held with all the homeowners associations attending, and presentations are made by public safety, both Sheriff's Office, CHP, and fire departments, and CAL FIRE. We developed some information regarding the Arnold Rim Trail, status on that, and we were able to get a very intensive report from our OES director, Michelle Peterson, and she provided information on the status of our bridges on Blagan Road and on Murphy's Drive. Unfortunately, we are held up once again in the permit process from Fish and Wildlife. Also, I understand we got the report back from the hydraulic study. Those are things required for the RFPs to construction once we get authorization and a clearance to perform that work. That work should take an estimated 5 days, if you will, for Murphy's Drive. And the Blagan Road will be more intense because it's a removal of a temporary bridge and using those permits, which are being applied for both locations at the same time. On the 6th, I attended the CSAC board meeting in Sacramento. This was a general board of directors meeting where they took positions and notified our county supervisors of the actions of the lobbyists for various ballot entries in November. They indicated a strong opposition to Measure 6, which is the ballot measure to defeat SB 1, which was the transportation tax. And they also elected to provide some support for that in that campaign. They did discuss what funding is going to be. The budget has been signed by the governor, and they look to different transfers and shortcomings on some areas, but those areas will be detailed before the next meeting and available to all members, which we are a member of. That's about it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Supervisor Garamendi.
ABC 1234 requires us to report out on activities that we received compensation or paid for. I attended many meetings this week, but none of them I got paid for. So in the interest of picking up my kids from school, I have nothing to report.
I have nothing to report. I had no expenses to the county. Also, as a matter of fact, my line item for expenses has been zilched out, so going forward here. But in the interest of time, I know you need to pick your kid up. I have nothing to report at this time. CAO Letts, County Council, Madam Clerk, no? Seeing nothing, we stand adjourned.
Is the budget hearing done then?
Yes.
I wasn't sure, I missed,
Yes.
so it's been adopted and,
No, it won't be adopted till the 25th of June.
okay.
It comes back, this was just direction to staff, or 25th of September. This was direction to staff what to do and bring it back.
Okay, but there's no meeting tomorrow?
No, no. We're good.